My son called and said, "Dad, why did you freeze the account? My wife is furious." I smiled and slid the binder across the table. My daughter-in-law went pale. "My name is Garrett. I am 69 years old and a retired structural engineer living in Atlanta. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to teach a harsh lesson to someone who mistook your kindness for weakness." The ringing of my phone cut through the quiet Tuesday evening at exactly 9 o'clock. I answered and was immediately met with the frantic, breathless voice of my 34-year-old son, Jared. "Dad, why did you freeze the account?" He practically screamed into the receiver. The background noise sounded like a crowded ballroom filled with the clinking of crystal glasses and classical music. I sat silently at my kitchen table, listening to his panic. "Chelsea is furious," he continued, his voice cracking with anxiety. "We are at her parents' annual charity gala. She just bid $15,000 on a luxury vacation package in front of 500 people. The auctioneer ran the card and it declined. Everyone was watching. Do you have any idea how humiliated she is? The elite of Atlanta are laughing at us." My son sounded as if the world was ending right there in that ballroom. He was not worried about why a $15,000 charge was attempted on a card meant for emergencies. He was only concerned about the wounded pride of his wife. Chelsea, a woman who grew up wrapped in the illusion of old money and white privilege, had just faced the ultimate public embarrassment. I could picture her standing there in her expensive gown, forced to hand the auctioneer a declined piece of plastic. Jared begged me to unfreeze the account immediately. He pleaded with me to call the bank and fix what he called a humiliating technical error so his wife could save face in front of her high society friends. He told me her parents were embarrassed. He told me Chelsea was threatening to leave the gala and leave him behind if he did not fix it. I let him talk. I let him pour out his desperation. I did not raise my voice. I did not yell. I did not match his frantic energy. After 40 years of building structural foundations for skyscrapers across this city, I had learned that the strongest materials are the ones that remain unyielding under pressure. "Jared," I said, my voice as cold and flat as a concrete slab, "if you want to know why the card declined, you will leave that gala right now and drive to my house. Bring your wife." The silence on the other end of the line was heavy. "Dad, we cannot just leave," Jared protested. "Chelsea is mortified. She wants the money transferred immediately so she can pay for the auction item. Bring your wife to my house right now," I repeated firmly. "If you are not standing in my kitchen in exactly 30 minutes, I will permanently close the account and you can figure out how to pay for your own life from now on." I ended the call without waiting for a reply. I placed my cell phone face down on the kitchen counter. I sat back in my chair and smoothed my hands over the thick leather binder resting on the wooden table in front of me. The binder was heavy, filled with pages of bank statements, transaction histories, and legal documents. I ran my thumb over the edge of the leather, feeling a profound sense of clarity. For months, I had played the role of the quiet, oblivious father. I had worn my faded plaid shirts, driven my old Ford pickup truck, and allowed my daughter-in-law to treat me like an uneducated blue-collar worker. I allowed her to roll her eyes at my house and mock my simple lifestyle. She thought I was just a tired old black man living on a meager pension. She thought she was untouchable because of her family name and her pale skin. She had no idea that the old man she despised was sitting on a real estate and private equity empire. I took a deep breath of the quiet air in my house. The time for pretending was over. The time for consequences had arrived. I opened the binder to the first page and waited. I adjusted the overhead light to illuminate the documents perfectly. I wanted every number and every undeniable piece of evidence to be clearly visible the moment they walked through the door. That platinum credit card was never meant to fund high society charity auctions. 2 years ago, Jared lost his mid-level marketing job during a round of corporate layoffs. He came to me crying because Chelsea was pregnant with my grandson and they were struggling to make their mortgage payments. As a father, my instinct was to protect my family. I handed Jared that corporate supplementary card and gave him one strict rule. This is for groceries, diapers, and basic household necessities until you find a new job. I trusted my son to honor that boundary. I trusted him to be a man. But Jared was weak and Chelsea was greedy. When Jared finally secured a new job, he never returned the card. Instead, Chelsea took possession of it. She slowly transformed my financial lifeline into her own personal slush fund. At first, it was small charges, a few $100s at a designer boutique, a charge for a luxury hair salon. I noticed the changes on my corporate statements, but I stayed silent. I wanted to see how far she would go. I wanted to see if my son would ever step up and stop his wife from stealing from his own father. He never did. The charges grew larger and more brazen month after month. Chelsea treated my money as if it were her birthright. She believed she was entitled to my wealth simply because she graced our family with her presence. Tonight was the final straw. Exactly 28 minutes later, the headlights of their luxury SUV flashed across my living room window. I heard the aggressive slamming of car doors, followed by heavy footsteps stomping up my porch. The front door burst open with such force that the handle slammed against the drywall. Jared walked in first, looking pale and utterly defeated in his tailored tuxedo. But it was Chelsea who commanded the room. She stormed into my kitchen like a hurricane wrapped in red silk. Her designer evening gown swept across my modest linoleum floor. Her face was flushed a deep, angry crimson, and her perfectly styled hair seemed to bristle with rage. She marched straight toward my kitchen table, the heels of her expensive shoes clicking sharply against the floor. "Garrett!" she screamed, her voice shrill and dripping with absolute venom. "How dare you? How dare you humiliate me in front of my family and my friends?" She did not greet me. She did not offer a shred of respect to the man whose house she had just invaded. She stopped inches from the table and pointed a manicured finger directly at my face. Her eyes were wide with a manic fury that comes from a lifetime of never being told no. "You intentionally declined that card to embarrass me," she yelled. "You are a bitter, miserable old man who hates to see anyone else succeed. I stood right there in front of the mayor and the entire charity board and looked like a fool because you decided to play games with our money. Turn the card back on right now. You owe me an apology, and you owe the gala a $15,000 check." I did not flinch. I just looked at her finger, pointing at my face, and smiled. Chelsea took my calm reaction as a personal insult. She slammed her expensive designer clutch onto my kitchen counter with a sharp thud and leaned over the table. Her face contorted with a pure, undisguised disgust that stripped away every ounce of her manufactured high society grace. "You think this is funny?" she hissed, her voice dropping into a harsh, vibrating register filled with a lifetime of inherited entitlement. "You think ruining my reputation in front of my peers is some sort of joke to you? I know exactly what you are doing, Garrett. You are a cheap, bitter old blue-collar worker who resents everything my family stands for. You have always hated the fact that your son married out of his league. You hate that I come from real generational money while you spent your entire life breaking your back in the dirt." Her words hung in the air, heavy with the racial and class undertones she usually kept masked behind fake, polite smiles at our rare holiday dinners. She paced a few steps across my kitchen, waving her arms frantically. "You are just an uneducated laborer who got lucky with a pension and thinks he can control us." She continued, her manicured hands trembling with absolute rage. "You could never possibly understand the pressure of my world or the expectations of the Whitmore family. We belong to the elite class of this city. We sit on influential charity boards. We fund hospitals. We hold the foundation of this community together. And you are just a stubborn old black man who refuses to stay in his proper lane. You intentionally set me up tonight to be humiliated in front of the most powerful people in Atlanta because you are deeply jealous of our status. You wanted to drag me down to your pathetic level to make yourself feel big." She crossed her arms over her chest and breathed heavily, convinced her vicious tirade had somehow put me in my place. She stared at me with an expression of absolute superiority, as if her pale skin and her family name gave her the divine right to speak to me like a disobedient servant inside my own home. I let her toxic words echo off the quiet kitchen walls. I did not raise my voice in retaliation. I did not defend my career or my intellect. I did not tell her that the dirt she claimed I broke my back in was the literal foundation of the very corporate skyline her elite friends admired from their penthouse suites. I simply shifted my gaze from her flushed, angry face to my son standing by the door. Jared stood frozen near the entryway, looking completely, entirely out of place in his tailored tuxedo. He shrank away from the conflict like a frightened child waiting to be scolded. I sat silently and waited for him to speak. I waited for the boy I raised as a single, hard-working father to step forward and defend my honor. I waited for him to demand respect for the man who paid his college tuition and financially supported him when he had absolutely nothing to his name. But Jared just stared down at the kitchen floor tiles. His silence was deafening and heartbreaking. It was the pathetic silence of a man who had completely surrendered his dignity to a woman who viewed him as nothing more than a convenient accessory. "Dad, please." Jared finally mumbled, his voice shaking with cowardice. He would not even lift his head to make eye contact with me. "Just call the bank customer service and unlock the card. Chelsea has suffered enough tonight. Her parents are waiting for us to return to the gala right now so we can pay for the auction package. If we do not go back with a working credit card, her family will be a laughingstock in the media tomorrow. You do not understand how these high society things work, Dad. We desperately need to save her reputation. Please, Dad, just fix this mess and we can talk about the charges tomorrow morning." He was practically begging me. He completely ignored the horrific, racist insults his wife had just hurled at my face. He ignored the profound disrespect happening under my own roof. My flesh and blood was asking me to bow down to a woman who had just called me a cheap laborer simply to keep the peace in his miserable, toxic marriage. The profound cowardice radiating from my son was a heavy emotional blow, but it only solidified the cold resolve I had built over the past few months. I looked at Jared and realized the strong son I thought I raised was gone. He had been replaced by a hollow shell of a man terrified of his own shadow and terrified of losing a woman who despised his roots. I turned my attention back to Chelsea. She was standing tall again, a smug, victorious expression spreading across her face. She truly believed her husband's pathetic plea had secured her absolute victory. She thought she had won the battle. She thought she was about to walk out of my kitchen with an unlocked corporate credit card and a renewed sense of unchecked power. I leaned back in my wooden chair and gave her another slow, deliberate smile. I placed my large, calloused hands on the thick leather binder resting on the table in front of me. I did not say a single word as I pushed it forward. The heavy binder slid smoothly across the polished wood surface and stopped exactly an inch from her fingertips. I gestured toward the black leather cover with a slight nod of my head. "If you want the card unlocked right now," I said calmly, "you need to open that binder and read the very first page out loud for me and my son. Go ahead, Chelsea. Show us exactly what kind of elite financial status you bring to this family. Show us the true power of the Whitmore name that you brag so much about." Chelsea let out a dramatic, condescending sigh. She rolled her eyes as if I were an annoying child asking her to participate in a foolish, pointless game. "Fine," she snapped, her voice dripping with extreme irritation. "If looking at some ridiculous household budget will make you feel important and get my card unlocked so we can leave, I will humor you." She reached out and flipped open the heavy leather cover with an exaggerated flick of her wrist. She fully expected to see a boring list of grocery bills or a written lecture on saving money. Instead, her arrogant eyes landed directly on a highlighted official bank statement I had pulled from my corporate account earlier that day. I sat back and watched the smug superiority melt off her face in a matter of seconds. The angry red color drained rapidly from her cheeks, leaving her skin a sickly pale white. Her mouth opened slightly, but no sound managed to escape her lips. Her eyes darted wildly across the page, desperately trying to process the numbers printed in bold black ink. There, explicitly detailed on the official bank letterhead, was a clear, undeniable financial trail. The document showed exactly $85,000 systematically drained from my corporate supplementary card over the past 12 months. The money had not been spent at a luxury boutique or a high-end salon. It had been transferred directly into a private external bank account, and the account did not belong to a fashion vendor or a business partner. The routing numbers matched an account belonging to William and Catherine Whitmore, her parents. The same wealthy elite parents she claimed were holding the community together and funding hospitals. Under the disguise of random fashion purchases and vague business expenses, Chelsea had been funneling my hard-earned money straight to her mother and father. She stared blindly at the paper as her manicured hands began to tremble violently. The room fell perfectly, devastatingly silent. The impenetrable elite facade of the wealthy Whitmore family was completely shattered, and she knew I possessed the absolute, undeniable proof of her crime. $85,000, I said, breaking the heavy silence that had suffocated my kitchen. My voice was calm and conversational even, but every syllable was a hammer striking the final nail into the coffin of her arrogance. That is the exact amount you stole from a cheap, bitter old blue-collar worker to keep the illustrious Whitmore family from drowning in their own debt. Chelsea swallowed hard, her eyes darting frantically from the bank statement to my face. The majestic, untouchable posture of a high society heiress was entirely gone. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the table, closing the distance between us. You see, Chelsea, when you own multiple commercial real estate properties and manage multi-million-dollar development projects across the state of Georgia, you tend to make friends with banking executives, financial analysts, and wealth managers. It was not very difficult for me to look past the shiny surface of those wire transfers. I know that the grand Whitmore estate in Alpharetta, the massive colonial mansion your parents love to host their pretentious charity galas in, has been secretly mortgaged to the hilt. I know they are currently 3 months behind on their payments and dodging calls from creditors. I watched her chest heave as she struggled to pull air into her lungs. The truth is a ruthless, blinding spotlight, and it was shining directly on the rotting foundation of her fake empire. I also know that my corporate credit card, the one I gave my son to buy diapers and formula for my grandson, was actively used to pay your father's exclusive country club membership dues. You used my money so William Whitmore could keep up appearances on the golf course and pretend he was still a titan of industry. I let the words sink into the quiet room. The absolute irony of the situation was sheer perfection. She had just spent the last 10 minutes lecturing me about the heavy expectations of the elite class, about how her family held the foundation of the community together. Yet behind closed doors, they were desperately surviving off the charity of the very black man she considered so far beneath her. Your parents are completely broke, Chelsea. They have been practically bankrupt for years. All that old money dried up long before you married my son. You have been playing a desperate, pathetic game of dress-up using the sweat and blood of a laborer you despise to finance a lifestyle you simply cannot afford. For a brief moment, looking at her wide, panicked eyes, I thought she might actually break down, apologize, or show a single ounce of genuine shame. But social predators like Chelsea do not surrender to the truth. They deflect and attack. The raw shock on her pale face quickly morphed back into a defensive, feral sneer. Her survival instinct kicked in, overriding any sense of morality. She slammed the heavy leather binder shut, though the sound lacked the authoritative punch she intended. "It is a business loan," she stammered, her voice shaking so badly it cracked on the last word. She violently cleared her throat, lifting her chin in a desperate attempt to regain her footing. "My father is expanding his commercial portfolio into new territories. We needed liquid capital for a short-term investment bridging gap. It was a temporary, informal loan, Garrett. We fully intended to pay it back with interest once the quarterly corporate dividends cleared. It was a pathetic, poorly constructed lie built on buzzwords she probably heard her father use to scam other investors. We both knew William Whitmore had not made a successful or profitable investment in over a decade. A loan, I asked, raising one eyebrow slowly. A loan requires a legally binding contract, Chelsea. A loan requires agreed-upon terms, signatures, and the explicit consent of the account holder. What you did, repeatedly transferring funds across state lines without authorization, is called wire fraud." She took a sudden step back, her red silk gown rustling sharply against the wooden chairs. Her eyes darted wildly around the room, searching for an escape route until they landed on the quiet, trembling figure of my son standing near the doorway. Like a drowning swimmer looking for a life raft to pull under with her, she lunged toward him. "Jared knows all about it," she declared loudly, pointing an accusing finger directly at her own husband. "He authorized every single transfer. He knew my parents were going through a temporary cash flow issue, and he explicitly agreed to help them. He is the one who suggested we use the corporate card to cover the country club fees because he wanted to impress my father. Ask him." Jared knew exactly where the money was going the entire time. The kitchen felt as if all the oxygen had been instantly sucked out of it, leaving a suffocating vacuum in its wake. I slowly turned my head away from the desperate lying woman and locked my gaze onto my son. Jared was staring intently at the floor tiles as if he wished the linoleum would crack open and swallow him whole. His hands were stuffed deep into the pockets of his expensive tuxedo pants, and his shoulders were hunched forward in a posture of total defeat. He looked incredibly small, completely stripped of the manhood I had spent decades trying to instill in him. "Jared," I said, my voice steady, deep, and carrying a dangerous, unyielding edge. "Look at me." He did not move. He did not breathe. He remained frozen like a statue of cowardice. "I asked you a direct question, son," I continued, demanding his full attention. "Did you know your wife was draining $85,000 from my business account to pay off her parents' debts?" Did you stand by and watch her steal from the man who put a roof over your head when you had absolutely nothing? I waited for him to furiously shake his head. I waited for him to shout that she was a liar, to defend himself, to defend me. I prayed to God that my boy had just been a blind fool, not a willing, silent accomplice. Slowly, agonizingly, Jared lifted his heavy head. His eyes were bloodshot, brimming with unshed tears of profound, miserable cowardice. He looked at Chelsea, who was glaring at him with a silent, terrifying threat in her eyes, a promise of absolute destruction if he did not back her up. Then he looked at me. I knew he whispered. The two words hit my chest with the physical force of a swinging sledgehammer. I felt a sharp, breathtaking pain radiate through my ribs, a pain far worse than any physical injury I had ever sustained on a construction site. You knew, I repeated, tasting the bitter, metallic tang of betrayal on my tongue. Why? Jared let out a pathetic, broken sob, the sound of a man who had completely lost his spine. Dad, you have to understand, he pleaded, stepping forward but keeping a safe, cowardly distance from the table. Chelsea was miserable. Her parents were constantly pressuring her for financial help, and they were threatening to cut her off socially from the family. She told me that if I did not help them maintain their status, she would pack her bags and leave me. She swore she would file for divorce, take my son, and move back into her parents' estate where I would never see him again. I could not lose my boy Dad. I could not let her take my son away from me. I thought I could just pay it back slowly once I got my year-end bonus at work. I was just trying to keep my family together. He stood there, a grown man, in a formal tuxedo, crying over his own monumental weakness. He had allowed his racist, entitled wife to rob his own father blind, simply because he was too terrified to stand up to her manipulation. He sacrificed my blood, my sweat, and my lifelong legacy to buy the fake affection of a woman who fundamentally despised him. It was not just a betrayal of my finances. It was a complete, devastating betrayal of my blood. That was the very first knife plunged directly into my heart, and it was held firmly by the hands of my only son. The sound of my son weeping over his own pathetic weakness hung heavily in the air of my kitchen. I stared at him, feeling the last remaining threads of my parental illusion snap and dissolve into nothing. But while Jared crumbled under the weight of his guilt, Chelsea experienced a completely different revelation. She looked at her husband sobbing on the floor and realized that playing the victim was no longer a viable strategy. The excuse of a temporary business loan was dead. The facade of an innocent, misunderstood wife had been incinerated the moment Jared confessed. I watched a fascinating and terrifying transformation take over her features. The panic completely drained from her face, replaced by a cold, calculating hardness. She straightened her posture, rolling her shoulders back until she stood tall and imposing in her red silk gown. She stepped away from Jared, casting a brief glance of pure disgust at his bowed head, and turned her predatory gaze back to me. If I was refusing to play the role of the compliant, silent benefactor, she was going to force me into a much darker, much more permanent role. She walked slowly back to the kitchen table, her heels clicking with a renewed menacing confidence. "You think you have won Garrett," she said, her voice dropping into a smooth, chillingly calm register. "You think pulling a bank statement makes you the master of this family. You think you can just cut off our funding and command us like obedient dogs. But you are vastly overestimating your own position. You are just a deteriorating old man whose mind is rapidly failing him." The words struck a strange chord in my mind. Instantly, a series of seemingly isolated events from the past month clicked together, forming a deeply disturbing picture. Chelsea had been making unannounced, highly unusual visits to my house lately, claiming she wanted my grandson to spend more quality time with his grandfather. Yet every single time she came over, strange chaos followed. I would leave my leather wallet on the entryway console, the exact same spot I had placed it for 20 years, only to find it completely missing hours later. My heavy Ford truck keys would vanish from the kitchen hook and mysteriously appear at the bottom of the laundry hamper, or shoved deep between the living room sofa cushions. I had spent frustrating, exhausting hours tearing my house apart, looking for my belongings, while Chelsea stood by, holding my grandson, offering fake, honey-sweet concern. She would place a gentle, comforting hand on my arm and ask if I was feeling all right. She would tilt her head with feigned worry and suggest that perhaps my memory was starting to slip in my old age. I had brushed it off as simple absent-mindedness. Now, looking at the cold malice in her eyes, the horrifying truth washed over me. She had not been acting as a caring daughter-in-law. She had been meticulously planting the seeds of a fabricated mental decline. She had been intentionally hiding my belongings, gaslighting me inside my own home, treating me like a senile fool to quietly build a false narrative of cognitive incompetence. Chelsea placed both of her hands flat on the wooden table, leaning in close so I could smell the sharp scent of expensive wine on her breath. Abruptly cutting off your own flesh and blood without a single word of warning is not the action of a sane, rational man, she declared, her voice ringing with a rehearsed, authoritative cadence. A healthy father does not maliciously freeze the financial lifeline of his only child and infant grandson in the middle of the night just to prove a point. These are erratic, hostile, and deeply paranoid behaviors, Garrett. You are completely losing your grip on reality. You are forgetting where you put your keys. You are misplacing your wallet. You are having sudden, inexplicable fits of financial paranoia and aggression. Everyone in my social circle has noticed it. Jared has noticed it. You are suffering from severe cognitive decline, and you are becoming a massive danger to yourself and the stability of our family. She was spinning a web of absolute fiction right in front of my face. She was twisting my deliberate, calculated financial lockdown into a symptom of advancing dementia. She was projecting her own malicious criminal actions onto my mental state, attempting to paint me as an unhinged, deteriorating old man who could no longer be trusted to handle his own checkbook. It was a breathtakingly evil strategy. If she could not manipulate me into giving her my money, she was simply going to erase my legal right to tell her no. She did not stop at verbal threats. With a swift, practiced motion, she reached into the designer clutch she had previously slammed on my counter. She pulled out a thick, folded piece of premium stock paper. She snapped it open with a sharp flick of her wrist and slammed it down onto the kitchen table right next to my leather binder. "I am not playing games with you anymore, Garrett," she spat, her eyes gleaming with a predatory, victorious triumph. "Take a very close look at that paper. This is a preliminary medical evaluation signed by Dr. Albright, one of the most respected private psychiatrists in the entire state of Georgia. Based on the detailed behavioral reports Jared and I have provided him over the last 6 weeks, he has officially determined that you are exhibiting severe signs of paranoia, aggressive dementia, and cognitive failure." I stared down at the paper. It was a formal medical recommendation for immediate psychological intervention and financial oversight. She had paid a doctor who had never even met me to sign away my sanity based entirely on her fabricated stories. Tomorrow morning, Chelsea continued, her voice rising in a victorious, threatening crescendo. "Jared and I are taking this exact document straight to a family court judge. We are filing a petition for emergency legal conservatorship. We are going to strip you of every single financial right you possess. You will not be allowed to sign a check, access a bank account, or manage a single piece of property you own. The court will appoint Jared as your legal guardian, giving us total unrestricted control over your entire estate and all of your assets. You will be placed on a strict allowance, and if you continue to act out, we will have you moved into a specialized care facility for your own safety. You wanted to use your money to humiliate me tonight, Garrett, but by tomorrow afternoon, you will not even have the legal authority to buy a cup of coffee without my explicit permission." Jared finally broke his frozen stance. He stumbled forward, his polished dress shoes slipping awkwardly against the modest linoleum floor, and dropped heavily onto his knees right beside my wooden chair. He looked up at me with wide, desperate eyes, clasping his hands together tightly as if he were praying at an altar. He was attempting to pivot instantly from a silent, cowardly accomplice to a compassionate, deeply concerned son. "Dad, please," he begged, his voice cracking with a sickening mixture of fake empathy and sheer panic. "Please do not make us do this the hard way. Do not force us to drag you into a courtroom and put you in front of a judge. You have worked so hard your entire life. I know how much you sacrificed building things for other people. You built an amazing career, but you are getting older now. The stress is clearly getting to you. It is time for you to just rest." He reached out, hovering his trembling hands over my arm without actually daring to touch me. "Just sign the papers voluntarily, Dad. Let me take over the accounts as your legal guardian. It is just a formality so we can help you manage things. If you just hand over the assets quietly, I swear to God I will protect you. I will make sure you stay right here in your own house. We will not put you in a nursing home. I promise you that on my life. We just want to manage the heavy bills, handle the complicated banking, and make sure you are safe from financial mistakes. We are doing this strictly out of love." He was actively weaponizing the sacred concept of family, twisting his ultimate devastating betrayal into an act of profound mercy. He honestly believed I was an ignorant, easily intimidated old man who would be absolutely terrified by the looming threat of a cold courtroom and a sterile, state-run facility. He thought his empty, hollow promises would be enough to break my spirit, bypass my defenses, and force my complete compliance. He wanted me to hand over the keys to my entire kingdom simply because he asked nicely while on his knees. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice, nor did I offer a single word of comfort to the kneeling, sniveling coward beside me. I simply shifted my cold gaze away from his pleading face and looked back down at the heavy leather binder resting on the table. With slow, deliberate precision, I reached out and turned to the second page. The thick, high-quality paper made a sharp, crisp sound that echoed loudly in the tense silence of the kitchen. I slid the open binder slightly toward them, tapping my heavy index finger against a highly detailed, multicolored spreadsheet. "You think you are incredibly clever, Chelsea," I said, my voice resonating with absolute icy control. "You look at me and you see a man who drives a dusty truck and lives in a modest single-story house. You assume I am completely oblivious to the modern world and easily manipulated. But a man who has spent 40 years building corporate high-rises and managing massive infrastructure projects knows exactly how to secure his own perimeter." I watched her eyes dart downward, scanning the complicated digital grids printed on the page. The panic that had briefly subsided was rapidly clawing its way back onto her face. The document in front of her was a comprehensive security and tracking report. It explicitly detailed the exact GPS coordinates of her luxury SUV, cross-referenced perfectly with the digital timestamps from the concealed high-definition security cameras I had installed around the exterior of my property 6 months ago. The cameras were so perfectly integrated into the brickwork and the roofline that she never even noticed them during her frequent intrusive visits. "Did you really believe I would not monitor my own home after my keys and my wallet miraculously started disappearing every time you walked through my front door?" I asked, leaning back in my chair and crossing my arms. "You wanted to build a fake medical history showing I was losing my mind, but all you did was prompt me to upgrade my surveillance system to military-grade specifications." I pointed to a specific bright yellow highlighted row on the spreadsheet. "Take a very close look at the entry from last Tuesday afternoon," I commanded. "At exactly 2 o'clock, I was attending a routine medical checkup at a clinic across town. A checkup, I might add, that you specifically scheduled for me, claiming you were highly concerned about my cholesterol and my blood pressure." I looked directly into her suddenly terrified wide eyes. But while I was sitting in that clinic waiting room reading a magazine, my security system alerted my phone to unauthorized activity at my front gate. The cameras recorded your exact license plate pulling into my driveway. And you did not come alone to check on my property. You brought a man in a tailored gray suit holding a clipboard. Chelsea sucked in a sharp, ragged breath. Her confident, imposing posture violently shattered, and she took a frantic step backward. The cameras captured absolutely everything. I continued, relentlessly making sure every word struck her like a physical blow. "They recorded the two of you walking the entire perimeter of my property. They recorded him taking extensive, highly detailed photographs of the foundation, the roofline, and the surrounding acreage. They recorded him pulling out a professional laser measuring device to calculate the exact square footage of my lot." Jared looked up from the floor, his face twisted in genuine raw confusion. He looked at the paperwork, then up at his wife, clearly having no idea what I was talking about. "What is he talking about, Chelsea?" Jared whispered, his voice trembling. "Who did you bring to the house?" "He was a commercial real estate appraiser," I stated loudly, slicing through my son's confusion. "Your loving, devoted wife brought a professional real estate appraiser to secretly evaluate my home while she purposefully sent me away on a wild goose chase to a doctor's office." I reached down and turned to the third page of the binder, revealing a thick stack of printed text messages and email correspondence. I had employed a private digital forensics firm to legally retrieve the metadata from the appraiser's public business server. I have the complete, unedited transcript of your email correspondence with him right here, I said, my voice hardening into impenetrable steel. "You told him the house itself was just an outdated teardown, but the land in this rapidly developing Atlanta neighborhood was worth at least $600,000 to the right commercial developer." I slowly turned my eyes back to Jared, who was still kneeling on the floor, his mouth hanging open in absolute shock. "You just promised me that I could stay in my own home if I signed your guardianship papers, Jared. You literally just swore to me on your life that you would never put your father in a facility. I grabbed the top sheet of paper from the stack and dropped it right in front of his face on the linoleum floor. "Read the text message your wife sent to her commercial real estate broker yesterday morning. Read it out loud." Jared hesitated, his hands shaking violently as he slowly picked up the piece of paper. He stared at the words, his eyes moving back and forth as the horrifying reality of his wife's ultimate plan finally registered in his brain. "Read it," I commanded, my voice booming in the quiet kitchen. Jared swallowed hard and read the text aloud, his voice barely a weak, devastated whisper. "As soon as the judge signs the emergency conservatorship order list the property for an immediate demolition sale, we will lock the old man in that state-run facility on the south side of the city. It is the absolute cheapest option, and we need to maximize the cash return from the land sale to cover our current debts." I watched my son drop the paper as if it had physically burned his fingers. He slumped back onto his heels, staring at Chelsea with a look of pure, unadulterated horror. The entire illusion of their compassionate family intervention was entirely incinerated. They did not just want to restrict my spending or manage my bank accounts. Chelsea was actively executing a meticulously calculated, ruthless plot to strip me of my sanctuary. She intended to throw me out onto the street, demolish the home I had paid for with decades of hard labor, and lock me away in a miserable, underfunded institution. She was willing to discard my life and my freedom just to liquidate the very dirt beneath my feet and fund her fake high society lifestyle. The absolute cruelty of her plan was completely exposed, leaving her with absolutely nowhere left to hide. The suffocating silence in the kitchen was suddenly shattered by the sharp, clear chime of the front doorbell. Jared physically flinched, his shoulders jumping as if he had been struck. Chelsea whipped her head toward the hallway, her eyes wide and frantic like a cornered animal. They had assumed this night was a private, isolated family dispute, a quiet battleground where they could bully an old man into submission behind closed doors. They were entirely mistaken. I did not react with surprise. I simply checked the gold watch on my wrist, noted the time, and pushed my chair back from the table. Right on schedule. I walked down the short hallway and opened the front door. 3 men stepped out of the humid Atlanta night and across my threshold. Leading the group was Oliver Stanton. He was a tall, imposing 55-year-old white man with silver hair perfectly swept back and eyes that held the warmth of a frozen lake. He wore a meticulously tailored navy blue suit that radiated wealth, authority, and ruthless precision. Flanking him were 2 younger, equally sharp individuals carrying thick, heavy locking briefcases. They moved with a silent, synchronized efficiency that instantly changed the entire atmosphere of my modest home. They did not look around. They did not offer polite greetings. They marched directly into the kitchen and stood behind my chair, forming a wall of absolute, undeniable power. Chelsea took a shaky step backward. She was a woman who spent her entire life desperately clawing at the edges of elite circles, trying to fake her way into high society. She immediately recognized the aura radiating from the men in my kitchen. This was not the fake rented luxury of the Whitmore family. This was real, devastating institutional power. Jared, still kneeling on the floor in a state of emotional shock, looked up and blinked in total confusion. He wiped his face with the sleeve of his expensive tuxedo and stared at the man leading the trio. "Mr. Stanton." Jared stammered, his voice cracking with bewilderment. "What are you doing here at this hour? Why is my dad's free tax guy standing in our kitchen?" Oliver Stanton looked down at my son. His expression did not change, but his eyes conveyed a level of pity that was almost painful to witness. He did not say a word. He simply turned his gaze to me, waiting for my instruction. I walked back to my seat, folded my hands over the leather binder, and looked at the son I had shielded from reality for far too long. "I let you believe a very convenient lie, Jared," I said, my voice steady and commanding. "For the past decade, whenever tax season rolled around, I told you Oliver was just an old buddy from the neighborhood. I let you believe he was a generous accountant who helped working-class folks file their simple tax returns for free out of the goodness of his heart. You believed it because you wanted to believe I was just a simple, struggling retiree surviving on a fixed income." I pointed a finger directly at the impeccably dressed man standing beside me. "Oliver Stanton does not file free tax returns, Jared. Oliver is a senior managing partner at one of the most ruthless, high-tier corporate law firms in the state of Georgia. He specializes in corporate acquisitions, aggressive wealth management, and white-collar fraud protection. And for the last 15 years, he has been the lead attorney and chief executor of the Hayes Family Trust." I paused, letting the heavy, unfamiliar words sink deeply into the minds of my son and my daughter-in-law. The Hayes Family Trust is a private equity portfolio and commercial real estate holding company. It is currently valued in the tens of millions of dollars. I am the sole founder, and I am the primary beneficiary. The money you thought you were stealing, the $85,000 you funneled to the bankrupt Whitmore estate, did not come from a meager retirement fund. It was illegally siphoned from a massive corporate entity. The color completely vanished from Chelsea's face. The arrogant, untouchable posture she had tried to maintain entirely disintegrated. The narrative she had built in her head, the story of the ignorant, poor black laborer she could easily crush, shattered into a million irreparable pieces. She realized in one horrifying instant that she had not picked a fight with a helpless old man. She had inadvertently declared war on a multimillionaire backed by a top-tier legal team. She was a minnow who had foolishly decided to attack a shark. At my signal, the two auditors stepped forward. They placed their heavy briefcases onto the kitchen counter, popped the combination locks in perfect unison, and pulled out several thick, meticulously organized folders. They set them down on the wooden table, aligning them perfectly next to my leather binder. Oliver Stanton stepped forward, completely ignoring Chelsea's trembling form. He did not offer his hand. He did not introduce himself to her. He treated her with the exact level of disdain usually reserved for a parasite. He unclasped his own leather portfolio, pulled out a thick, legally bound document stamped with official court seals, and dropped it directly onto the center of the kitchen table. The heavy thud echoed like a gunshot in the quiet room. "Those documents are not informal family budgets," Mrs. Hayes Oliver said, his voice slicing through the air like a sharpened blade. He spoke with the cold, detached authority of a man who destroyed lives for a living. "They are comprehensive forensic accounting reports generated over the last 48 hours by my senior auditing team. We have tracked every single penny that left my client's corporate account. We have the exact routing numbers, the digital timestamps, and the receiving signatures from your parents' bank." He tapped a manicured finger against the medical evaluation Chelsea had proudly slammed on the table moments earlier. "That preliminary psychiatric evaluation you purchased is not worth the paper it is printed on. As the lead executor of the Hayes Family Trust, I hold the ironclad legal authority over all of Mr. Hayes's assets. Even if you somehow managed to find a corrupt judge willing to grant your husband a fraudulent conservatorship, it would be entirely useless. The trust is legally structured to be completely untouchable by any external guardian or family member. You spent your time plotting a hostile takeover of an empty house, completely unaware that the vault was located miles out of your reach. But we are not here to simply defend Mr. Hayes from your pathetic attempt at medical extortion. We are here to go on the offensive." Chelsea took another step back, her back hitting the edge of the kitchen counter. Her breathing became rapid and shallow. "Wait!" she gasped, holding her hands up in a frantic defensive gesture. "This is a family dispute. We can settle this privately. Jared is his son. We can work out a repayment plan. I will get my father to sign a promissory note. You cannot just come into this house and threaten us." Oliver cut her off, instantly stepping forward and towering over her trembling frame. "This ceased being a private family dispute the exact moment you decided to embezzle corporate funds to finance your parents' country club lifestyle," he stated coldly. "You do not seem to comprehend the sheer magnitude of the situation you have created for yourself. I am not here to negotiate a repayment plan, Mrs. Hayes. I am here to serve you with official notice." He pointed down at the heavy document stamped with the court seals. "That is a formal legal filing," Oliver declared, delivering the fatal, crushing blow without a single ounce of mercy. "My firm has already submitted a comprehensive evidence packet directly to the authorities. We are not suing you in civil court for a simple breach of trust. We are formally pressing criminal charges against you for federal wire fraud." He stared dead into her terrified, wide eyes, ensuring she understood the absolute certainty of her destruction. By transferring funds across state lines and utilizing electronic banking systems to deliberately embezzle $85,000 from a registered corporate entity, you committed a severe federal offense. The United States government takes a very grim view of white-collar financial crimes. The maximum penalty for a single count of federal wire fraud is 20 years in a federal penitentiary. The trap has already been sprung, Mrs. Hayes. You are not walking out of this kitchen with a warning. You are looking at a federal indictment. The word penitentiary hung in the kitchen air like a swinging guillotine. For a fraction of a second, the sheer gravity of a 20-year federal prison sentence paralyzed Chelsea. Then the aristocratic facade she had carefully maintained her entire life violently shattered. She did not politely ask for clarification. She did not attempt to negotiate. She completely lost her mind. She let out a piercing, hysterical scream that echoed off the cabinets. "You are a liar!" she shrieked, pointing her manicured finger at Oliver Stanton. "You are nothing but a hired actor in a cheap suit brought here to intimidate me. This is harassment. This is illegal. You cannot walk into this house and threaten me with federal charges over a simple family misunderstanding." She was hyperventilating, her chest heaving under the red silk of her gown. She whipped her head around to look at Jared. "Do something," she commanded, her voice shrill and desperate. "Are you just going to let these thugs stand in your father's kitchen and threaten your wife with prison? Throw them out. Call the police and have them arrested for trespassing. Be a man for once in your miserable life and protect me." But Jared did not move a single muscle. He remained glued to the floor, his knees pressed against the linoleum. The terrifying reality of a federal indictment had completely short-circuited his brain. He knew Oliver Stanton was not a hired actor. He recognized the heavy, high-quality paper of the legal filings and the terrifying precision of the auditing team. Jared looked up at his wife, his face completely drained of color, his eyes wide with absolute horror. He was fully aware that wire fraud was not a simple misunderstanding. He knew that the federal government did not care about the social standing of the Whitmore family. His cowardice had finally caught up to him, leaving him paralyzed in the face of inevitable destruction. He simply lowered his head back down, refusing to meet Chelsea's frantic, demanding gaze. Seeing that her husband had entirely abandoned her to the wolves, Chelsea let out a frustrated, guttural sound. I simply raised my right hand, gesturing for Oliver to continue. Oliver Stanton was completely unfazed by her hysterical outburst. He had dismantled billionaire executives and corrupt politicians in courtrooms across the country. A screaming entitled socialite was barely a warm-up exercise for him. He smoothly turned to the next page of the thick auditing report. "We are not finished, Mrs. Hayes," Oliver said, his voice maintaining its cold, surgical precision. "The $85,000 you embezzled from my client's corporate account is only the beginning of your legal exposure. Let us discuss your highly publicized luxury fashion boutique located in the heart of Buckhead." Chelsea flinched. Her eyes darted toward the briefcases on the counter. Oliver signaled one of the auditors, who immediately slid a new, heavily documented file across the kitchen table. "You have spent the last 2 years actively bragging to local magazines about your incredible success as an independent female entrepreneur." Oliver continued, tapping the file. "You claim your boutique is highly profitable. However, my forensic auditing team took the liberty of performing a deep dive into your public commercial filings, your vendor payments, and your international shipping manifests. We discovered a very disturbing pattern of financial inconsistencies. You have not just been using Mr. Hayes's stolen money to pay your parents' country club dues. You have been actively using those embezzled funds to mask a severe operational deficit in your business, while simultaneously transferring undeclared cash into offshore accounts." Oliver leaned forward, pressing his hands flat against the table. "You have been systematically dodging domestic business taxes, Mrs. Hayes. You created a fraudulent paper trail to hide your boutique's failing revenue, and you used international wire transfers to hide taxable income from the Internal Revenue Service. Tax evasion and international money laundering are serious federal crimes. The government does not offer payment plans for intentional, premeditated corporate fraud. They offer federal prison sentences." The sheer volume of evidence against her was staggering, yet Chelsea's toxic survival instinct refused to let her surrender. Driven entirely into a corner, she abandoned her panicked screaming. Instead, a cold, arrogant smirk slowly spread across her face. It was the desperate, twisted smile of a predator who believed she still held one untouchable trump card. She let out a sharp, mocking laugh, tossing her hair over her shoulder as she forcefully regained her composure. "You think you are so smart, Garrett," she sneered, dropping the polite pretense and addressing me directly with absolute contempt. "You think bringing your fancy corporate lawyer here changes anything about my business. That boutique is a limited liability company. It is registered exclusively under my name. You have absolutely no legal standing to audit my private company, and you have zero authority to access my internal financial records. Any information you claim to have is completely inadmissible because it is none of your business. That store is my private property." Her smirk widened into a malicious, vindictive grin. She took a step closer to the table, staring me dead in the eyes. Go ahead and try to report me, she challenged, her voice dripping with pure poison. Call the authorities. File your little lawsuit. But the very second you do, I will burn this entire family to the ground. I will immediately file for divorce. I will drag your pathetic, spineless son through the most vicious, expensive public divorce this city has ever seen. I will take half of everything he owns. But more importantly, Garrett, I will take my son. She paused, letting the heavy threat of my grandson hang in the tense air. I will pack up your only grandson tonight, and I will disappear. I will tie you up in family court for the next 10 years. I will move out of state, and I will make absolutely sure that you never ever see that boy again. You will die alone in this cheap, pathetic house, and your grandson will not even know your name. Is your precious corporate money really worth losing your own blood? Chelsea stood tall, radiating an overwhelming, sickening sense of triumph. She adjusted the neckline of her ruined red silk dress, thoroughly convinced she had just played the ultimate checkmate. In her twisted elite worldview, emotional blackmail and familial leverage always overrode the law. She firmly believed that the threat of losing my grandson would instantly force me to fold, withdraw the lawyers, and beg for her mercy. She looked down her nose at me, her chest rising and falling with pure arrogance. She was basking in her perceived untouchability, reveling in the cruel power she thought she wielded over my heart. She waited for the panic to set into my eyes. She expected me to call off Oliver Stanton and surrender my empire just to keep a relationship with my grandson. She was completely, blissfully unaware that the ground beneath her feet had already been rigged with explosives, and she was standing directly on the detonator. "You can threaten to take my grandson away, Chelsea," I said, keeping my voice dangerously low and steady. "You can threaten to drag my cowardly son through a brutal divorce. But before you pack your bags and march out of my house, you need to fully understand the reality of your precious independent business." Chelsea let out a sharp, mocking laugh that bounced off the kitchen walls. She tossed her hair over her shoulder, completely unbothered by my warning. "You cannot touch my business, Garrett," she declared, her voice dripping with an overwhelming hollow pride. "You have absolutely no leverage over my boutique. I built that luxury brand from the ground up with my own 2 hands. I did not rely on Jared's mediocre salary, and I certainly did not ask for a single dime of your pathetic retirement savings. I am a self-made woman. 2 years ago, I secured a $500,000 angel investment all on my own. I stood in a corporate boardroom and pitched my vision to an exclusive private equity firm. They recognized my talent. They saw my potential. They handed me $500,000 in capital because I am a brilliant entrepreneur, and they knew I would generate massive returns. You and your fancy lawyers have zero jurisdiction over my investors." She stood there, practically glowing with arrogance, wearing her fabricated success like a suit of armor. She truly believed her $500,000 funding was a testament to her inherent superiority. She thought she had outsmarted the world, completely unaware that the board members she pitched to were simply following a highly specific script I had written for them. I did not offer a verbal response. I did not need to. I simply turned my head slightly and gave a subtle, silent nod to Oliver Stanton. Oliver immediately stepped forward. He did not engage in a shouting match with her. He reached into his heavy leather briefcase and retrieved a sleek metallic mini projector. He placed it precisely on the edge of the kitchen island, angled the glass lens toward the large blank beige wall next to my refrigerator, and wirelessly paired the device with his tablet. Chelsea crossed her arms defensively, rolling her eyes at the sudden setup. "What is this?" she snapped, her tone laced with irritation. "Are you going to show me a slideshow to bore me to death? If you think some cheap presentation is going to intimidate me into giving up my company, you are even more delusional than I thought." Oliver ignored her completely. He tapped a button on his screen, and a bright, high-definition corporate organizational chart suddenly illuminated the wall. It was a complex, multi-tiered diagram composed of interlocking boxes and directional arrows. Mrs. Hayes Oliver began, his voice perfectly modulated and surgical. "You are indeed the registered chief executive officer of your boutique. However, as is standard practice with mezzanine financing agreements, the $500,000 capital injection you so proudly secured did not come without substantial conditions. When you signed that contract, you legally traded 80% of your company's equity for that cash flow." Chelsea sneered, clearly unimpressed. "I know how equity financing works," she retorted, lifting her chin. "Apex Capital Ventures owns the shares. They are my silent partners. They review my quarterly reports, but they do not have the right to interfere with my daily operations or audit my personal accounts." Oliver pressed a key on his tablet. A bright red arrow illuminated on the wall, pointing directly upward from the tiny logo of Chelsea's boutique at the bottom of the screen, connecting straight to a box labeled Apex Capital Ventures. "That is correct," Oliver stated. "Apex Capital is the direct shareholder on paper, but Apex Capital is merely a Tier 3 subsidiary." He tapped the screen again. Another bright red arrow extended upward from Apex Capital, linking it to a Delaware-based limited liability company. From there, the laser line traveled upward again, connecting to a blind trust registered in the state of Wyoming. Chelsea's smug expression began to falter as the complicated financial diagram grew taller and more intricate. "These are shell companies, Mrs. Hayes," Oliver explained, methodically pacing slowly in front of the projection. "They are perfectly legal financial vehicles designed specifically to obscure the identity of the primary capital provider. Your brilliant high-tier investors were nothing more than proxy managers. They were executing direct orders from a much higher authority who preferred to remain entirely anonymous." Chelsea stared at the glowing wall, her arms slowly dropping to her sides as the massive web of corporate ownership towered over her boutique's tiny logo. The realization that she was a very small fish in an incredibly large pond was finally beginning to penetrate her stubborn ego. Oliver pressed one final key on his tablet. The highest box on the organizational chart, the Master Holding Corporation, sitting at the absolute peak of the pyramid, glowed bright green. The text inside the box flipped over to reveal the identity of the singular entity holding 100% of the voting shares across the entire network. My name, Garrett Hayes, flashed onto the wall in bold, undeniable black letters. Chelsea stopped breathing. Her mouth fell open as her eyes darted frantically from my name on the wall to my face and back again. The shock hit her with the physical force of a freight train. The uneducated, blue-collar old black man she had spent the entire evening insulting, threatening, and degrading was the very angel investor who funded her entire dream. I was not just her despised father-in-law. I owned the majority of her business. I was her absolute, undeniable boss. The glowing green box projected on the wall reflected in Chelsea's wide, terrified eyes. The name Garrett Hayes burned into her retinas, aggressively dismantling every single delusion she held about her superior place in the world. I watched the exact second her legs gave out. Her knees violently buckled beneath the expensive red silk of her designer gown, utterly unable to support the crushing weight of her new reality. She lunged sideways, her manicured fingers desperately clawing at the curved back of one of my cheap wooden kitchen chairs to prevent herself from collapsing entirely onto the linoleum floor. Her knuckles turned a stark bone white as she gripped the wood, her chest heaving with rapid, shallow, panicked gasps. The impenetrable, arrogant armor of her high society white superiority had been completely pulverized in an instant. For years she had paraded around Atlanta, treating me like a filthy, uneducated laborer. She had viewed me as an embarrassment, an unwanted burden to be hidden away from her elite peers. She had wielded her family name like a weapon, entirely convinced her generational status inherently elevated her far above a black man who drove a beat-up Ford pickup and wore faded plaid shirts. Now, staring at the projected organizational chart, the horrifying truth completely suffocated her. She was not a self-made prodigy. She was not a brilliant independent entrepreneur. She was an unwitting employee, a puppet dancing on strings I had personally financed and controlled from the very beginning. She had spent 2 long years eagerly cashing massive checks signed by the very man she considered deeply beneath her contempt. Jared remained on his knees a few feet away, staring at the projection with his mouth hanging open, entirely useless, as he watched his wife's fake empire evaporate into thin air. Chelsea tried to speak, but her throat only produced a weak, raspy clicking sound. The sheer magnitude of her humiliation was absolute, stripping away her voice and leaving her gasping for air like a landed fish. I did not offer her a glass of water. I did not offer her a moment to collect her shattered dignity or catch her breath. I kept my voice perfectly level, ensuring every single syllable struck her with maximum devastating impact. When you secured that $500,000 capital injection 2 years ago, Chelsea, you were far too eager to play the role of a powerful chief executive officer to actually read the fine print of your own mezzanine financing agreement. You saw a massive check and immediately assumed your unmatched brilliance had conquered the financial sector. But in the ruthless world of private equity, whoever holds the gold holds the absolute power. I recited the specific legal clauses from memory, letting the unyielding reality of corporate law wash over her trembling frame. Section 4, paragraph 2 of your operating agreement clearly states that the primary investor holding 80% of the company's equity retains absolute controlling interest. It legally guarantees majority voting rights and grants the primary shareholder the unilateral authority to restructure executive management at their sole discretion. I gave you that funding through my blind proxy managers because I wanted to see if you actually possessed any real business acumen. I wanted to see if the woman my son married was a genuine asset to his life or a parasitic liability. You proved exactly who you are. You did not build a sustainable, profitable business. You built a personal piggy bank to fund your fake aristocracy. You used my corporate capital to fund your lavish lifestyle, to hide your parents' embarrassing bankruptcy, and to dodge federal taxes through offshore accounts. You never actually owned that boutique, Chelsea. You were merely renting the title, and your lease has officially expired. Oliver Stanton stepped forward again, breaking his rigid, intimidating stance just enough to pull a crisp sealed document from his heavy leather briefcase. He handed it to me with a brief, deeply respectful nod. I placed it squarely on top of the leather binder, directly in Chelsea's line of sight. She stared down at the thick, watermarked paper as if it were a loaded weapon aimed right at her chest. This is the official transcript and formalized minutes of an emergency board of directors meeting, I declared, tapping the document with a heavy, calloused finger. The meeting was convened at exactly 8 o'clock this morning at the downtown executive offices of the Hayes Family Trust. Because I hold 100% of the voting power of the master holding corporation that owns Apex Capital Ventures, a quorum was easily established without your knowledge. I am the board, Chelsea. And this morning the board conducted a comprehensive forensic review of your executive performance. I let the heavy weight of the corporate execution settle over the quiet kitchen, the only sound being her ragged, terrified breathing. We reviewed the meticulous auditing reports detailing your offshore cash transfers. We examined the precise path of the $85,000 you embezzled through wire fraud to pay William and Catherine Whitmore's exclusive country club dues. We analyzed the blatantly falsified revenue statements you submitted to your silent partners to mask your operational deficits and failing sales. In the professional corporate sector, we do not view these actions as simple accounting errors or temporary family loans to tide your parents over. We view them as a catastrophic breach of fiduciary duty, gross financial negligence, and outright criminal activity. You violated every single clause of your executive employment contract. You maliciously utilized company infrastructure to commit federal crimes, heavily exposing the brand and its shareholders to massive legal and financial liability. A competent, self-made businesswoman would know that actions like these carry immediate, devastating, and permanent consequences. You arrogantly assumed that registering your business as a limited liability company somehow shielded you from all accountability. You failed to realize that the legal shield only protects the company from your creditors, not you from the company's majority owner. The board of directors does not tolerate thieves, and it certainly does not finance their fake high society lifestyles. Therefore, based on your egregious financial misconduct and your criminal negligence, the board executed a unanimous vote, I stated, delivering the final fatal blow to her fabricated career. You are officially terminated from your position as Chief Executive Officer effective immediately. You are permanently stripped of all executive privileges, company assets, and operational access. You do not own the designer inventory. You do not own the commercial storefront. You do not even own the legal rights to the name of the brand you claim to have built. As of 5 o'clock this evening, my private security firm arrived at the property and physically changed the locks on the front and back doors of your boutique. Your corporate email accounts have been permanently deactivated, and your business banking accounts are completely frozen by the financial institution. Tomorrow morning, when your employees arrive for work, they will be greeted by a transition management team, and you will not be permitted on the premises. You are walking out of my house tonight with absolutely nothing. Your fake elite empire is entirely dead, Chelsea. You have lost everything, and you have no one to blame but yourself. Chelsea was hyperventilating, sliding down the edge of the wooden chair, her fabricated empire turning to ash around her. Jared watched his wife's absolute destruction and realized the impenetrable shield of her family name was completely gone. His panic immediately shifted from blind confusion to desperate self-preservation. He saw the ship rapidly sinking and made the instantaneous cowardly decision to throw his own wife overboard to save himself. He scrambled frantically across the linoleum floor on his hands and knees, his expensive tailored tuxedo wrinkling and collecting dust. He practically threw himself at my feet, reaching out to grab the hem of my jeans with trembling, sweaty hands. "Dad, you have to listen to me," he cried, tears streaming down his face, completely abandoning any remaining shred of his dignity. "I did not want any of this. She made me do it." He pointed a shaking finger at Chelsea, who was too consumed by the horrifying reality of her financial ruin to even register her husband's sudden vicious betrayal. "She manipulated me, Dad." Jared sobbed, his voice echoing loudly in the tense kitchen. "From the very beginning, she told me that if I did not help her secure funding for her parents and her business, she would leave me. She constantly told me I was a failure, that my salary was pathetic compared to the successful men in her elite social circle. She threatened to take my son away from me. She told me she would move back to her parents' estate and hire ruthless, high-priced lawyers to ensure I never got custody. I was terrified. I was just trying to keep my family together. I swear to you, I never wanted to steal from your accounts. I never wanted to put you in a medical facility. That was entirely her idea. She is toxic, Dad. She poisoned my mind. She kept pushing and pushing, insulting my manhood until I felt like I had no other choice but to go along with her insane criminal plans. Please, Dad. You know me. You raised me. I am not a criminal. I am just a victim of her horrible manipulation. Please forgive me. I will divorce her tomorrow morning. I will kick her out. I will do whatever you want. Just give me another chance." I looked down at the man weeping on my kitchen floor. I thought about the 40 years of brutal, exhausting, hard labor I had endured. I thought about the countless hours of working overtime on dangerous construction sites, pouring concrete and tying rebar in the blazing Georgia heat, building an empire from the ground up so my son would never have to struggle the way I did. I had sacrificed my own comfort wearing cheap clothes and driving an old truck to ensure he received a premier college education without a single dime of student debt. I had hoped he would grow into a man of unbreakable integrity, honor, and strength. Instead, I was looking down at a spineless, sniveling coward who was eagerly and maliciously throwing the mother of his child under the bus the very second his own comfort was threatened. I did not reach out to touch him. I did not place a comforting hand on his shaking shoulder. I did not offer him a single shred of paternal warmth, understanding, or forgiveness. The absolute disgust I felt in that moment permanently severed whatever lingering emotional ties I had left for the boy I had raised. I kept my posture rigid and my expression entirely blank, a cold monument of judgment. With slow, deliberate movements, I reached forward and grasped the heavy edge of the leather binder resting on the table. I bypassed the financial audits, the GPS tracking logs, and the corporate restructuring documents. I flipped past the undeniable evidence of his wife's wire fraud and the fake medical evaluations. I grabbed a large block of thick pages all at once, turning them over and letting them fall heavily to the left side, exposing the very last section of the dossier. I smoothed my hand over the crisp white paper, feeling the terrifying weight of undeniable truth resting right beneath my fingertips. When you use a cell phone that is registered, paid for, and managed under my corporate telecom account, Jared, you surrender the right to absolute privacy. I stated, my voice cutting through his pathetic sobbing with a harsh mechanical precision. You clearly thought hitting the delete button on your text threads effectively erased your digital footprint. You assumed your private, malicious, late-night conversations with your wife were securely wiped from existence. But digital data never truly disappears, son. It simply waits on a cloud server for a highly paid forensic data recovery firm to retrieve it. I tapped my index finger heavily against the top of the page. This is a certified, legally authenticated transcript of the deleted text messages recovered from your specific device over the past 90 days, I explained, watching the blood completely drain from his tear-stained face. My corporate security team pulled the complete, unedited communication logs between you and Chelsea. You just sat there on my floor and claimed you were a terrified, manipulated hostage in your own marriage. You claimed you were desperately fighting to protect me from her malicious schemes. You just swore on your life that the horrifying plan to strip me of my human rights and lock me in a state-run facility was entirely her idea. I leaned slightly forward, forcing him to look directly at the printed screenshots illuminated by the bright kitchen light. The green and gray text bubbles were perfectly preserved on the paper, complete with exact digital timestamps and read receipts. Let us see exactly how much of a victim you truly were, Jared. I did not ask him to read it this time. He was already hyperventilating, his eyes scanning the page as the final absolute destruction of his character stared back at him. I read the message aloud myself, ensuring every single word struck his ears like a physical blow. This text message was sent directly from your phone exactly 3 weeks ago on a Thursday night at 11:45. I read, my tone sharp and completely devoid of mercy. Chelsea sent you a message complaining about how long the medical evaluation process was taking. She was whining about the upfront cost of bribing the fake psychiatrist. And this was your direct, unedited reply. I paused for a fraction of a second, letting the crushing anticipation build in the dead silence of the room before delivering the killing strike. You wrote, "Just let the old man sign the papers. I am tired of waiting too. Once he is locked in that facility and we get control of the money, we will buy a new mansion in Buckhead. We will never have to step foot in his pathetic house again." Jared let out a sharp, choked gasp as if all the oxygen had been violently punched out of his lungs. He scrambled backward, pulling his hands away from the edge of my jeans as if the denim itself were burning hot. The entire narrative of the poor, manipulated, helpless husband instantly evaporated into thin air, leaving behind nothing but the ugly, undeniable reality of a greedy, traitorous son. He had not been coerced by his wife. He had not been threatened into compliance. He had eagerly, willingly, and maliciously anticipated my absolute destruction. He had gleefully counted the money he planned to steal, calculating how to finance a luxury mansion over my metaphorical grave. His ultimate betrayal was not a tragic byproduct of a toxic marriage. It was a conscious, eager, and unforgivable choice. The crushing weight of the printed text message completely paralyzed Jared on the kitchen floor. He had absolutely no excuses left to offer. He could not hide behind the facade of a manipulated husband anymore. But while my son was entirely broken by his own exposed malice, Chelsea reacted like a cornered rabid animal. She saw her husband weeping, she saw her fake corporate empire reduced to ashes, and she realized she was completely out of options. Instead of surrendering or showing a single ounce of remorse, she went entirely unhinged. She violently pushed herself off the kitchen counter, her face twisting into a mask of pure, unfiltered hatred. She pointed a shaking, manicured finger at me, her voice escalating into a deafening, hysterical shriek that bounced sharply off the walls of my home. "You think you have taken everything from me?" she screamed, her vocal cords straining under the sheer volume of her rage. "You think taking away my boutique and freezing a credit card is going to leave me begging on the streets? You are completely delusional, Garrett. I do not care about your stupid corporate accounts anymore. I do not care about that ridiculous store. Jared and I still own a multi-million-dollar estate in the most exclusive neighborhood in Atlanta. That mansion was our wedding gift. It is our property. Tomorrow morning I am calling the top real estate broker in the state and I am listing that house for sale. We will liquidate the entire estate and walk away with millions of dollars in pure cash. I will use every single penny of that money to hire the most ruthless, aggressive defense attorneys in the country. I will countersue you for corporate sabotage, defamation, and severe emotional distress. I will drag your name through the mud, tie up your precious trust fund in litigation for decades, and watch you rot in this pathetic little house while I destroy your entire legacy." She was breathing heavily, her chest heaving as she spat her venomous threats. She was utterly convinced that the sprawling, pristine mansion they lived in was her ultimate, untouchable safety net. She firmly believed that no matter what happened in this kitchen tonight, she could simply sell the roof over her head to finance her revenge and maintain her wealthy lifestyle. I did not even blink at her frantic declarations. I simply remained seated, my hands folded calmly over the leather binder. Beside me, Oliver Stanton let out a soft, sharp clearing of his throat. It was a remarkably quiet sound, yet it sliced through Chelsea's hysterical screaming with the absolute precision of a surgical scalpel. Oliver did not look angry or intimidated by her threats. He looked profoundly bored. He calmly reached down into his heavy locking briefcase for what would be the final time this evening. With slow, deliberate movements, he withdrew a thick, pristine stack of legal documents bound by a heavy blue seal. He did not slam it down like the previous files. He placed it gently onto the wooden table right next to the forensic accounting reports and the printed text messages. He tapped the top of the crisp paper with his silver pen, capturing Chelsea's wild, frantic attention immediately. Mrs. Hayes Oliver said, his voice maintaining a chilling surgical detachment. "It is highly advisable that you consult with a qualified real estate attorney before you attempt to contact a broker. If you attempt to list the property you currently reside in for sale, you will be immediately arrested by state authorities for real estate fraud." Chelsea froze, her mouth still slightly open from her previous tirade. "What are you talking about?" she snapped, though the absolute panic was rapidly beginning to leak back into her voice. "That house was a wedding present. It belongs to us. We chose the layout. We picked the neighborhood. It is my house." Oliver slowly shook his head, a gesture entirely devoid of any sympathy. "You have spent the last 5 years living under a very generous, heavily orchestrated illusion," he explained, folding his hands together. "When you and Jared were married 5 years ago, my client did indeed purchase that sprawling mansion in Buckhead. He paid for it entirely in cash to ensure there was no mortgage weighing down the property. However, as a man who has spent his entire life navigating the treacherous waters of commercial wealth, Mr. Hayes is not in the habit of blindly handing over multi-million-dollar assets to young, financially unproven couples. He never transferred the deed to your husband. He certainly never put your name anywhere near the title. That house is legally owned in its entirety by the Hayes Real Estate Holding Trust, an anonymous corporate entity that Mr. Hayes controls exclusively." The color drained from Chelsea's face once again. She took a shaky step back, her eyes locked on the blue-sealed documents. Oliver continued delivering the devastating legal reality without a single pause. "You do not hold a single percentage of equity in that property. You cannot sell it. You cannot borrow against it. You cannot leverage a single brick of that foundation to pay for your criminal defense lawyers. You own absolutely nothing." Chelsea looked as if she had been physically struck by a heavy blow. She stared blankly at the table, her mind desperately trying to reject the horrifying reality crashing down upon her. She had spent 5 long years hosting lavish dinner parties in that house. She had spent years bragging to her high society friends and her bankrupt parents about her gorgeous estate, parading around as the wealthy mistress of a grand manor. She had arrogantly decorated it with expensive art and custom furniture, treating the grounds as her sovereign territory. The sudden brutal realization that she was completely assetless hit her with catastrophic force. The mansion she thought was her ultimate financial weapon was just another piece of my sprawling empire. She was not a queen in a castle. She was merely a guest who had vastly overstayed her welcome. Oliver delivered the final, devastating legal blow without missing a beat. "Because the trust holds the exclusive title to the property, your legal status for the past 5 years has never been that of a homeowner," he stated, his words echoing brutally in the quiet kitchen. "You and your husband are legally classified as residential tenants. You are tenants who have been occupying a premium luxury estate while paying exactly $0 in rent. You have lived completely rent-free on the charity of the very man you just plotted to lock in a state-run mental facility." Oliver picked up the top sheet of the bound document and pushed it directly across the smooth wood toward her trembling hands. "And as the sole executor of the holding trust, Mr. Hayes held an administrative meeting this afternoon. We have formally signed a binding lease termination order. Your free ride is officially over." Oliver Stanton did not simply hand over the lease termination order. He slid the crisp legal document forward with the precise, calculated movement of a coroner pulling a sheet over a corpse. "You have exactly 72 hours to completely vacate the premises, Mrs. Hayes," he stated, his voice echoing with absolute, unrelenting authority in the quiet kitchen. "That timeline is legally binding and entirely non-negotiable. By Monday morning at 8 o'clock, my private security contractors will arrive at the Buckhead estate to permanently change the locks and secure the perimeter. If you or your husband are found anywhere on the grounds after that exact minute, you will be immediately arrested and charged with criminal trespassing." Chelsea stared blankly at the document, her chest heaving with rapid, shallow breaths. Her eyes were completely bloodshot, reflecting a terrifying mixture of shock and sheer panic. But Oliver was not finished delivering the devastating terms of her eviction. He unbuttoned his suit jacket and leaned slightly forward, ensuring she absorbed every single word of her new reality. Furthermore, he continued, his tone dropping into a chillingly calm register. "You will only be permitted to remove your personal effects from the property. You may pack your clothing, your shoes, your makeup, and your personal electronics. That is all. Every single piece of custom furniture you bragged about purchasing, the imported artwork, the expensive Persian rugs, the crystal chandeliers, and the high-end appliances, remain exactly where they are. They were purchased entirely using funds generated by my client. Therefore, they are the exclusive legal property of the Hayes Real Estate Holding Trust. If you attempt to load a single sofa, a single painting, or a single silver spoon into a moving truck, my legal team will immediately file additional felony charges against you for grand larceny. You will leave that house with exactly the same amount of wealth you brought into this family, which is absolutely nothing." The sheer brutal finality of Oliver's words hung heavily in the air. The grand illusion of the wealthy, untouchable Whitmore heiress had been completely eradicated. Chelsea slowly turned her head away from the legal documents on the table and looked down at Jared. Her husband was still kneeling on the linoleum floor, weeping silently into his hands, utterly destroyed by the exposure of his own treacherous text messages. The realization that she was permanently chained to a man who possessed zero assets, zero power, and zero future finally snapped the last remaining thread of her sanity. The aristocratic facade of the high society socialite vanished instantly, replaced by a feral, vicious monster. Chelsea let out a piercing, guttural scream that sounded more animal than human. She violently lunged toward Jared, her manicured hands turning into rigid, sharp claws. She threw her entire body weight against him, tackling him right there on my kitchen floor. "You pathetic, worthless loser," she shrieked, her voice cracking with pure, venomous hatred. Her acrylic nails dug viciously into the shoulders of his expensive tuxedo, tearing the fine fabric and scratching deeply into his neck. "You promised me we were rich. You promised me you had control over this miserable old man. You are nothing but a weak, empty-handed puppet. You have absolutely nothing." Jared cried out in pain, raising his arms frantically to shield his face from her relentless assault. She slapped him repeatedly across the head, screaming obscenities that echoed off the cabinets. She cursed his name, she cursed his cowardice, and she violently cursed the day she ever decided to marry a man she considered so far beneath her social standing. "I married you because you were supposed to inherit a fortune," she sobbed, her hands raining blows down upon his chest. "You are a broke, pathetic failure, and you dragged me down with you." For the first time in his entire miserable life, Jared finally reached his breaking point. Humiliated beyond repair by his father, completely stripped of his dignity by the lawyers, and now being physically battered by a wife who openly admitted she only ever wanted his money, his cowardice morphed into a sudden burst of panicked adrenaline. He let out a loud, desperate yell and forcefully shoved her away. He pushed his hands hard against her collarbone violently, throwing her backward to escape her scratching nails. Chelsea stumbled backward, entirely caught off guard by his sudden physical resistance. Her high heel snapped sharply under her shifting weight, causing her ankle to twist awkwardly. She lost her balance completely and crashed hard onto the kitchen floor. The heavy impact knocked the breath out of her lungs. Her beautiful, expensive red silk evening gown was now twisted and ruined around her legs. Her perfectly styled blonde hair was a chaotic, frizzy mess sticking to her tear-stained cheeks. She lay there on the cold, hard linoleum, looking exactly like the broken, bankrupt fraud she truly was. The magnificent elite princess of the Whitmore family had been reduced to a screaming, brawling mess, fighting on the floor of a blue-collar worker's home. The kitchen fell into a brief, terrifying silence, interrupted only by the sound of Jared panting heavily and wiping the blood from the scratch on his neck. He scrambled backward, pressing his back against the baseboards, desperate to get as far away from her as possible. Chelsea slowly pushed herself up onto her hands and knees. Her breathing was ragged and uneven. She slowly lifted her head and stared blankly at the wall. Her mind was actively fracturing under the unbearable weight of her consecutive losses. In the span of 30 minutes, she had lost her $500,000 corporate boutique. She had lost her multi-million-dollar luxury mansion. She was facing 20 years in a federal penitentiary for wire fraud and tax evasion. And her marriage, the only vehicle she had left to access any form of wealth, was entirely, completely dead. She had absolutely no money, no home, no career, and no future. She slowly turned her head and looked directly at the kitchen table. Her wild, bloodshot eyes locked onto the heavy black leather binder. The binder contained the forensic bank audits, the printed text messages, the GPS tracking logs, and the corporate restructuring documents. In her deeply fractured, hysterical state of mind, the binder represented the sole source of her absolute destruction. She completely abandoned all logic and reason. She genuinely believed that if she could simply destroy the physical pieces of paper resting on that table, she could somehow erase the devastating consequences of her actions. She thought tearing up the evidence would magically make the federal indictment disappear. A low, menacing growl vibrated in the back of her throat. Chelsea stood up abruptly, kicking off her broken high heels and tossing them aside. Her eyes were completely devoid of any remaining sanity, burning with an explosive primal madness. She did not look at Jared, and she did not look at Oliver Stanton. She locked her terrifying, unhinged gaze entirely on me. She let out a deafening, ear-splitting roar of pure desperation and lunged her entire body forward. She launched herself directly across the kitchen table, throwing her arms out violently toward my chest. Her hands stretched forward like rigid claws, aiming straight for the heavy leather binder, attempting to snatch the documents and tear the evidence of her crimes into 1,000 irrecoverable shreds. I did not raise my hands to shield my face. I did not even flinch as her manicured claws reached frantically for the heavy leather binder resting on the table. Before her fingers could even graze the cover of the evidence dossier, a sudden blur of motion erupted from the hallway. Oliver Stanton is a man who calculates every possible variable, and he had explicitly anticipated a violent reaction from a cornered predator. The undercover police officer who had been stationed silently on my front porch for the past hour burst through the entryway with explosive speed. He moved with the precise, practiced force of law enforcement neutralizing an active threat. He intercepted Chelsea mid-flight, grabbing her firmly by the shoulders and using her own forward momentum to drive her hard onto the kitchen floor. The brutal impact shook the linoleum and the breath left her lungs in a sharp, stunned gasp. The officer swiftly pinned her arms behind her back, pressing his knee firmly between her shoulder blades to completely immobilize her thrashing body. She kicked her bare feet wildly against the cabinet, screaming in a pitch that shattered the remaining quiet of the room. "Let me go!" she shrieked, her face pressed painfully against the cold floor tiles. "You cannot do this to me. Do you know who my family is? Get your filthy hands off me right now." The cold metallic click of the steel handcuffs locking tightly around her wrists echoed through the kitchen. It was a sharp, unforgiving sound that instantly severed her connection to the elite world she so desperately worshipped. The heavy steel chains bound the hands of the woman who had spent her entire life believing her wealth, her pale skin, and her family name granted her absolute immunity from the consequences of her actions. I sat calmly in my wooden chair and watched the magnificent heir of the Whitmore legacy writhing on the floor of a blue-collar worker's home like a common street criminal. The stark contrast was absolutely breathtaking. Her expensive red silk designer gown was torn at the seams and stained with the dust of my floor. Her perfect blonde hair was plastered to her sweaty forehead in a chaotic, frizzy mess. The aura of aristocratic invincibility that she had used to terrorize my son and belittle me was completely eradicated. She had spent years looking down her nose at me, mocking my faded plaid shirts and calloused hands, genuinely believing that her social class elevated her far above the reach of the law. She thought the justice system was designed strictly to police people who looked like me, not people who looked like her. She assumed her pedigree was a permanent, impenetrable shield. But the cold steel cuffs biting into her wrists did not care about the exclusive country club she belonged to. The officer pinning her to the ground did not care about the exorbitant price tag of her dress or the wealthy neighborhood she claimed to rule. The harsh, unyielding reality of the criminal justice system had violently crashed into her perfectly curated bubble. She was no longer a prominent socialite holding court at a charity gala, sipping champagne and bidding on luxury vacations. She was a restrained, humiliated suspect lying in the dirt, completely stripped of the artificial power she had wielded for so long. The systemic privilege she had weaponized against me had utterly failed to protect her from her own staggering greed. Jared remained pressed against the baseboards nearby, his eyes wide with absolute paralyzing terror as he watched his wife being treated exactly like the violent felon she had become. He did not say a word. He did not move to help her. He simply watched the destruction of the woman who had orchestrated his downfall. Chelsea thrashed her head to the side, glaring up at the officer with a look of pure, venomous entitlement. "I am calling my father's lawyers right this second," she spat, her voice shaking with unchecked rage. "You are going to be fired for this outrage. I will post bail for this ridiculous assault charge before midnight, and I will sue this entire police department for using excessive force." She honestly believed this was a minor inconvenience. She viewed her arrest as a simple misdemeanor she could easily sweep under the rug with a quick phone call and a massive check from her supposedly wealthy parents. She clung desperately to the delusion that her elite status would grant her a swift release and a quiet settlement. The officer did not flinch at her empty, arrogant threats. He calmly pulled her up from the floor by her arms, forcing her to stand awkwardly on her bare feet. He held her firmly by the bicep, ensuring she could not make another sudden, violent movement. "Chelsea Whitmore Hayes," the officer stated, his voice projecting absolute, unshakable authority. "You are currently being placed under arrest for the attempted physical assault of Mr. Garrett Hayes. However, you will not be given the opportunity to post a simple local bail tonight or call your father's civil lawyers." The officer looked directly into her furious, tear-stained eyes, stripping away her final shred of hope. "Your detainment this evening extends far beyond a standard state-level assault charge. We have been coordinating directly with federal authorities for the past 48 hours regarding your corporate financial activities." Chelsea stopped struggling instantly. Her entire body went completely rigid as the word federal registered in her panicked, frantic mind. The fire in her eyes was abruptly extinguished, replaced by a cold, hollow dread. Oliver Stanton stepped forward, adjusting his tailored suit jacket with a look of supreme surgical satisfaction. "I told you, Mrs. Hayes," Oliver said coldly, his voice echoing in the stunned silence of the kitchen. "I do not make empty threats. My firm did not just compile those forensic accounting reports to show Mr. Hayes the extent of your betrayal. We handed the complete, undeniable evidence dossier directly to the United States Department of Justice." The officer tightened his grip on her arm and delivered the final, devastating blow. "I am executing a primary federal arrest warrant issued directly by the Federal Bureau of Investigation." The officer declared, the heavy weight of his words crushing the last ounce of defiance out of her soul. "You are being officially indicted by the FBI on multiple felony counts of interstate wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and international money laundering. You are not going to a local county holding cell, Mrs. Hayes. You are being transferred immediately into federal custody, and you will remain there without the possibility of bail pending your formal arraignment." The trap had officially snapped shut, and her elite privileged life was permanently, irrevocably over. The horrifying reality of federal custody finally breached the thick walls of Chelsea's lifelong delusion. The terrifying prospect of a windowless concrete cell stripped of her designer clothes and her high society status sent her into a state of absolute unhinged panic. She twisted wildly in the grip of the undercover officer, the steel handcuffs clinking sharply against her wrists as she fought a battle she had already completely lost. She threw her head back, her face contorted in sheer desperation, and screamed for her right to legal counsel. "I demand my phone!" she shrieked, her voice tearing through the quiet kitchen like a jagged piece of glass. "I have the right to a phone call. You cannot drag me out of here without letting me contact my family. My father plays golf with federal circuit judges. He dines with state senators. You are making the biggest mistake of your miserable careers. Let me call my father right now. He will wire $1 million for my bail before I even reach the station, and he will bring a team of defense attorneys who will absolutely bury all of you." Oliver Stanton looked at the arresting officer and gave a slow, deliberate nod. The officer easily maintained his firm grip on her arms, holding her securely in place while he reached down with his free hand and retrieved her expensive smartphone from the floor where her clutch had spilled open. He placed the device squarely in the center of my wooden kitchen table, tapped the screen, and hit the speakerphone button. He dialed the contact labeled as her father. The line began to ring, the electronic sound echoing loudly in the tense, suffocating atmosphere of the room. Chelsea stopped thrashing, her breathing ragged and heavy, a manic gleam of hope reigniting in her bloodshot eyes. She was entirely convinced that William Whitmore, the mighty patriarch of her elite family, would instantly answer the call, summon his immense wealth, and deploy his terrifying influence to crush me and my legal team into dust. The ringing stopped. The line connected, but instead of the booming, arrogant, authoritative voice Chelsea expected to hear, a weak, trembling sound crackled through the speaker. "Dad," Chelsea screamed immediately, not giving the old man a second to speak. "Dad, you need to listen to me right now. Garrett has gone completely insane. He hired some corrupt corporate lawyers, and they brought a federal officer to his house. They are trying to arrest me for wire fraud. You need to call your legal team immediately. Tell them to bring cash. Tell them to bring everything we have. We need to destroy this miserable old man and lock him away. Hurry up and get me out of here." She waited for the reassuring, powerful response from her father. She waited for him to roar with aristocratic fury and promise swift, devastating retribution. Instead, a hollow, pathetic sob vibrated from the phone's small speaker. The sound was so broken, so utterly defeated, that it did not even sound like William Whitmore. "Chelsea." Her father gasped, his voice cracking with a profound, suffocating despair. "The bank just called us 2 hours ago. We do not have any lawyers to send you. We do not have any bail money. We do not even have the money to pay for the gas in our cars." Chelsea froze, the manic energy instantly draining from her body. "What are you talking about?" She snapped, her voice trembling with confusion. "Just liquidate one of the investment accounts. Sell the summer property. I am being taken to a federal holding cell. Dad, you have to do something. We have absolutely nothing left." "Chelsea." William wept, the sheer magnitude of his financial ruin bleeding through the digital connection. "Every single one of our bank accounts has been completely frozen by the Federal Reserve. Our credit lines have been entirely severed. A private equity firm, some massive anonymous corporate entity, just executed a hostile buyout of all our outstanding debts. They bought the overdue mortgage on the Alpharetta estate. They bought the defaulted loans from the country club. They purchased every single toxic financial liability we have been hiding for the past 7 years. And they just called in every single debt simultaneously. They demanded immediate full payment in cash, and because we cannot pay, they have initiated an aggressive total asset seizure. They are foreclosing on the mansion. They are liquidating the vehicles. They have stripped us of every single asset to cover the margins. We are entirely ruined, Chelsea. The Whitmore legacy is completely dead. We are entirely bankrupt. The kitchen fell into a devastating, absolute silence. Chelsea stared at the phone on the table as if it had suddenly turned into a venomous snake. Her mouth opened, but her vocal cords were completely paralyzed. The massive, impenetrable fortress of her family name, the aristocratic shield she had used to belittle my son and degrade my existence, had just been vaporized into ash. The realization that her parents were just as broke, just as powerless, and just as utterly destroyed as she was, hit her with catastrophic force. There was no cavalry coming to rescue her. There were no high-powered defense attorneys waiting to post her bail. She was going to be locked in a federal prison cell, and no one in her illustrious elite family had a single dime to save her. I pushed my chair back, the wooden legs scraping loudly against the linoleum. I stood up to my full height, straightening my faded plaid shirt, and walked slowly toward the center of the kitchen. Jared backed away, pressing himself firmly against the wall, entirely terrified of the man he had called his father. I stepped right next to the table, looking down at the cuffed, shattered woman trembling on my floor. I leaned forward, lowering my face just inches from the speakerphone. "Good evening, William," I said, my deep voice projecting a cold, absolute authority into the microphone. "This is Garrett Hayes." I heard a sharp, panicked gasp from the other end of the line. William Whitmore recognized my name immediately. He recognized the name of the uneducated black laborer he had sneered at during his daughter's wedding reception. "I want to formally introduce myself," I continued, showing absolutely no mercy to the weeping man on the phone. "I am not just the father of the man your daughter manipulated. I am the sole founder, primary shareholder, and chief executive of Apex Debt Acquisitions. My firm is the anonymous corporate entity that just purchased the entirety of your miserable, failing financial portfolio for pennies on the dollar. I have been quietly holding the leash to your entire estate for the past 6 months, patiently waiting for the exact right moment to pull it tight. You allowed your daughter to steal $85,000 of my hard-earned corporate funds to finance your fake, pathetic country club lifestyle. You sat in your mansion and gladly accepted stolen money from a working-class man to hide your own catastrophic failures. Therefore, I simply decided to collect on my investment. I own your mortgage. I own your vehicles. I own the very ground your colonial mansion is built upon." "No, please," William begged, his voice reducing to a pathetic, high-pitched whimper. "Garrett, please, we had no idea where the money was coming from. We did not know she was stealing. Please do not do this to us. We will lose everything. You already lost everything the moment you thought you could treat my family like a disposable bank account," I stated coldly, completely ignoring his pathetic pleas for mercy. "I am the man who holds your entire future in the palm of my hand. And I am officially notifying you that the bank is not going to negotiate a settlement. You have exactly 30 days to completely vacate the Alpharetta estate. If you are not entirely off my property by the end of the month, my asset recovery team will arrive with local law enforcement to physically drag you out and dump your belongings onto the curb. Have a wonderful evening, William." I reached out and tapped the red button on the screen, instantly terminating the call and plunging the kitchen back into a heavy, suffocating silence. Chelsea's mind completely and violently broke. The absolute, irreversible destruction of everything she had ever valued finally fractured her fragile sanity. With a sudden, explosive burst of unhinged adrenaline, she threw her upper body forward against the grip of the police officer. She swung her cuffed hands wildly toward the kitchen table. Her wrists slammed heavily into the expensive smartphone, sweeping it forcefully off the edge of the wood. The device plummeted toward the ground and smashed violently against the hard linoleum floor. The screen spiderwebbed into 1,000 tiny, jagged pieces of broken glass, reflecting the scattered, ruined fragments of her elite life. The loud crack of the shattering phone echoed through the house, serving as the final definitive period to the legacy of the Whitmore family. Chelsea collapsed entirely against the officer, her legs giving out completely as she dissolved into loud, uncontrollable broken wails. She had nothing left to fight with, nothing left to steal, and absolutely nowhere left to hide. The undercover officer did not offer a single ounce of sympathy to the broken, weeping woman on the floor. He hauled Chelsea upward by her cuffed arms, forcing her to her feet with a swift, practiced motion. Her legs wobbled, entirely drained of the fierce, aristocratic energy she had paraded around my kitchen just an hour earlier. The heavy, torn fabric of her red silk designer gown dragged pathetically across the linoleum, sweeping over the shattered fragments of her cell phone. She did not fight back anymore. Her spirit was completely and irreversibly crushed under the massive weight of the federal indictment and her family's total financial ruin. The officer marched her firmly down the hallway toward the front door. Through the living room windows, the harsh, flashing red and blue lights of a federal transport vehicle painted the walls in frantic, chaotic strokes, signaling the absolute end of her elite existence. Oliver Stanton and his two auditors quietly packed their forensic reports and legal documents back into their locking briefcases, snapping the clasps shut with a synchronized, finalized rhythm. Oliver gave me one last respectful nod, silently acknowledging the completion of our primary objective, before leading his team out the door directly behind the officer. The heavy wooden front door slammed shut, severing Chelsea from my life permanently. The engine of the transport vehicle revved loudly in the quiet neighborhood and then faded into the distance as a cold rain began to fall. The suffocating high-stakes chaos that had filled my home evaporated, leaving behind a heavy, crushing silence. Only two people remained in the kitchen, myself and the son who had conspired to destroy me. Jared was still pressed against the baseboards, shivering uncontrollably in his ruined, wrinkled tuxedo. He watched the door close, realizing that the formidable shield of his wife's family name had just been hauled off to a federal holding cell. He was entirely alone, stripped of his arrogant partner and facing the absolute wrath of the man he had plotted to lock in a psychiatric ward. The sheer panic in his eyes morphed into a desperate, calculating survival instinct. He saw that his excuses of being a manipulated, helpless hostage had completely failed, so he instantly pivoted to the only strategy he had left. He resorted to weaponizing his own childhood. Jared pushed himself away from the wall and began to crawl across the kitchen floor. He dragged his knees directly over the sharp, shattered glass of Chelsea's broken phone, completely ignoring the small cuts tearing through his expensive trousers. He reached my chair and threw his arms around my legs, burying his tear-stained face against my knees. He let out a loud, agonizing wail, desperately trying to summon the ghost of the innocent boy I had raised. "Dad, please do not throw me away," he sobbed, his voice cracking with a manufactured theatrical agony. "I am still your son. I am still the little boy you raised. Do you remember when we used to sit at this exact kitchen table and build those wooden model airplanes? Do you remember when you worked those exhausting double shifts on the construction site just to buy me that red bicycle for my 10th birthday? You taught me how to ride it in the park down the street. You held onto the seat and promised you would never let me fall. You promised you would always protect me, Dad. I am so incredibly sorry. I lost my way. The money, the status, the pressure of trying to fit into her toxic world, it completely blinded me. I forgot everything you taught me about honor and hard work. But I can change. I swear to God I can fix this. Send me to therapy. Send me to a rehabilitation clinic. I will work for you at the holding trust, starting at the very bottom. I will sweep the floors of your office building. I will do whatever it takes to prove that I am still your blood. You built this massive empire for your family, Dad. Please look at me. I am your family. Do not let me lose my father tonight." I remained perfectly still in my wooden chair. I did not attempt to pull my legs away from his frantic, desperate grip, nor did I reach down to comfort him. I simply tilted my head and looked down at the top of his shaking form. I searched my own heart for a spark of paternal affection, for a flicker of sympathy, for the familiar urge to protect my child from the harsh consequences of his actions. I found absolutely nothing. The internal reservoir of love and patience I had maintained for 34 years was completely bone dry. As a structural engineer, I knew that a building with a rotten foundation could not be saved, it had to be demolished. There was no anger left in my chest. There was no overwhelming sadness. There was only a glacial, impenetrable emptiness. I was looking down at a biological stranger who happened to share my facial features. "Jared," I said, my voice echoing with a flat, terrifying indifference that caused his sobbing to instantly halt. "The little boy who built model airplanes on this table died the exact moment you typed a text message eagerly anticipating my confinement in a state-run mental institution. The boy I taught to ride a bicycle ceased to exist the second you stood in this kitchen and allowed a racist, entitled woman to insult my decades of grueling labor. You are not weeping right now because you are experiencing a profound moral awakening. You are not crying because you feel genuine remorse for betraying your father. You are crying because the massive, endless bank account you thought you were entitled to has just been permanently locked away from you. You are mourning the loss of the luxury mansion in Buckhead. You are terrified of the sudden crashing reality of having to actually work for a living. You are utilizing my memories, my sacrifices, and my deep paternal love as cheap manipulative bargaining chips to save yourself from poverty. It is a pathetic, deeply insulting performance, and I am completely immune to it. Jared slowly lifted his head, his tear-filled eyes widening in absolute horror as the cold, mechanical reality of my words struck him. He realized with devastating clarity that I was completely unreachable. He loosened his grip on my legs, his hands sliding down to rest helplessly on the floor. As his arms shifted, the bright kitchen light caught the heavy, unmistakable gleam of polished gold resting on his left wrist. It was a solid gold Rolex Daytona, a ridiculously expensive timepiece that he had proudly flaunted at every family gathering for the past 2 years. He had claimed it was a celebratory bonus from his marketing firm, but my forensic auditors had already confirmed it was purchased directly with the embezzled funds from my corporate account. I stared at the shining watch, the ultimate symbol of his unearned, fraudulent privilege. "Take it off," I commanded, pointing a heavy, calloused finger directly at his wrist. Jared froze his breath, hitching in his throat. What he whispered, looking down at his own hand in sheer panic. I said, "Take off the watch, Jared." I repeated my tone, leaving absolutely zero room for negotiation. "You bought that timepiece using the blood and sweat of a man you conspired to destroy. It does not belong to you. You are walking out of my house tonight with exactly the same amount of dignity and wealth that your wife left with. You have no access to my cars, you have no access to my bank accounts, and you will not wear a $30,000 watch funded by my holding trust while you wander the streets. Unclasp the watch, place it on the table, and get out of my sight. You are officially erased from my legacy." Jared stared down at his left wrist. The heavy gold timepiece, a symbol of the fake aristocracy he had so desperately tried to buy his way into, suddenly looked like a massive, suffocating shackle. His fingers trembled violently as he fumbled with the intricate metallic clasp. The mechanical click of the metal releasing sounded unnaturally loud in the devastated kitchen. He slid the heavy watch off his wrist and placed it gently onto the wooden table right next to the forensic accounting reports that had sealed his fate. The polished gold gleamed brightly under the overhead light, creating a stark, sickening contrast to the absolute ruin surrounding him. He did not say another word. He did not attempt to formulate another pathetic apology. He slowly pushed himself up from the linoleum floor, his movements stiff and mechanical, like a man walking directly to his own execution. His expensive tailored tuxedo was covered in floor dust and ripped at the collar where his wife had violently assaulted him. He looked absolutely pathetic, a hollow shell of the man I had raised. I watched him turn his back to me and walk down the short hallway toward the front entryway. He reached out with a shaking hand and grabbed the brass handle. He pulled the heavy front door open, exposing the dark, unforgiving Atlanta night. A cold, torrential downpour had begun to fall while we were inside, dismantling his fraudulent life. The heavy rain lashed aggressively against the porch steps, washing over the pavement in rapid, violent streams. Jared stood on the threshold for a fleeting moment. He had no car keys in his pocket, as the luxury SUV he drove was registered entirely under my corporate fleet. He had no active credit cards. He had no home to return to, and the woman he had sold his soul to please was currently sitting in the back of a federal transport vehicle. He stepped out into the freezing downpour. The heavy rain instantly soaked through his ruined tuxedo jacket, plastering his hair to his forehead and soaking him to the bone. He did not look back. He simply lowered his heavy head and began to walk down the dark, flooded street with absolutely nothing to his name. I stepped forward and firmly pushed the heavy wooden front door closed. The sharp metallic click of the deadbolt sliding perfectly into place echoed with an absolute, undeniable finality. I stood in the entryway for a long moment, listening to the muffled sound of the rain beating against the exterior siding of the house. The suffocating, toxic chaos that had poisoned my home for hours was finally gone. The air felt incredibly light, completely purged of the suffocating arrogance that Chelsea and Jared had brought across my threshold. I walked back into the kitchen. Oliver Stanton was standing near the countertops, having just secured the last of his legal documents inside his locking briefcases. He looked at me with the silent, deep understanding of a man who had witnessed the absolute worst of human nature and survived it. Without needing a single word of instruction, Oliver turned and walked directly to the small, dark wood liquor cabinet I kept near the pantry. He opened the glass door, reached past the ordinary bottles, and retrieved a rare, aged Kentucky bourbon I saved strictly for monumental occasions. He pulled 2 heavy crystal tumblers from the shelf and poured a generous, neat measure of the amber liquid into each glass. He handed one to me. We stood in the center of my kitchen, surrounded by the remnants of the shattered Whitmore illusion. The broken glass from Chelsea's destroyed cell phone still littered the linoleum floor, glittering under the harsh lights. We did not offer a verbal toast. We did not exchange congratulatory remarks about our overwhelming legal victory. We simply raised our glasses in a mutual, silent acknowledgement of the brutal, necessary surgery we had just performed. I took a slow sip of the bourbon. The smooth, fiery liquid burned pleasantly down my throat, grounding me entirely in the reality of the present moment. The house was entirely mine again. My empire was secure. The malignant tumor that had attached itself to my family had been aggressively and permanently excised. We stood in the profound, heavy quiet, savoring the absolute peace of total victory. The profound silence of the kitchen was suddenly and violently ruptured. The sharp, piercing ring of the old landline phone mounted on the hallway wall sliced through the quiet atmosphere like a blaring siren. I frowned, lowering my crystal tumbler to the counter. Very few people possess the number to that specific landline, and absolutely no one should be calling it at this late hour of the night. I exchanged a brief, cautious glance with Oliver. He set his drink down, his professional instincts instantly reigniting. The celebration of our victory was abruptly suspended. I walked out of the kitchen and down the hallway, reaching out to grab the heavy plastic receiver. I lifted it to my ear, preparing myself for the next inevitable complication. "This is Garrett Hayes," I stated, my voice steady but braced for impact. "Mr. Hayes," a woman's voice replied through the receiver. Her tone was brisk, highly procedural, and entirely devoid of emotion. "My name is Agent Davis. I am calling from the Fulton County Department of Child Protective Services. We are contacting you because you are listed as the primary emergency family contact on a priority intake file." I felt a sudden, sharp tightening in my chest. The residual adrenaline from the evening instantly spiked again, flooding my veins. "What is the exact situation, Agent Davis?" I asked, my grip tightening aggressively on the phone handle. "We currently have a highly sensitive situation regarding a minor child," she explained methodically, sticking strictly to her official script. "Approximately 1 hour ago, a woman named Chelsea Whitmore Hayes was processed into a federal holding facility. During the mandatory intake and booking procedure, she indicated that she has a young son who is currently without a designated legally responsible caregiver." The reality of the situation crashed down upon me with devastating force. In the midst of the complex corporate audits, the federal indictments, and the brutal domestic warfare that had consumed the evening, the most vulnerable innocent casualty had been temporarily left in the shadows. My grandson. The only pure blood left in this entire ruined legacy. "Where is the boy right now?" I demanded, my voice hardening with immediate fierce protective instinct. "He is currently at your son's leased residence in Buckhead under the supervision of a private nighttime nanny," Agent Davis stated. However, the nanny's scheduled shift ended at midnight. When the parents failed to return home or answer any calls, she followed protocol and contacted the authorities. "We have attempted to reach the biological father, Jared Hayes, multiple times over the last 40 minutes. Every single call is going directly to a disconnected voicemail. He is entirely unreachable, and his current whereabouts are completely unknown to our department." The sheer terrifying gravity of my son's pathetic cowardice was now directly impacting the next generation. Jared was wandering aimlessly in the freezing rain, entirely stripped of his phone and his assets, completely abandoning his own flesh and blood to the cold, unforgiving machinery of the state. He ran away from his responsibilities, leaving a helpless infant stranded in a massive, empty house. "If we cannot secure a verified, legally capable family placement for the child within the next hour," Agent Davis continued, her voice delivering the ultimate horrifying ultimatum, "we will have absolutely no choice but to dispatch officers to remove him from the premises. He will be placed immediately into the emergency state foster care system until a judge can review the custody files." My grandson was entirely stranded. His mother was locked inside a federal holding cell facing 20 years in prison. His father was a homeless, unemployed coward wandering the dark streets of Atlanta. He had absolutely no one left in the world to protect him from the foster system, except the man his parents had conspired to destroy. I did not hesitate for a single second. "I will be there in 20 minutes, I declared, slamming the phone down and turning back to Oliver. Oliver Stanton did not ask a single question. He simply grabbed his briefcase and followed me out the door into the freezing torrential rain. We climbed into my old Ford pickup truck, the heavy engine roaring to life as I slammed my foot on the gas pedal. We tore through the flooded streets of Atlanta, heading directly toward the sprawling Buckhead mansion I had just legally reclaimed. The irony of the situation was completely overshadowed by the fierce, undeniable protective instinct burning in my chest. My son had cowardly fled into the night, and his wife was sitting in a federal holding cell, leaving a helpless infant abandoned in a massive empty house. I was not going to let the cold, bureaucratic machinery of the state swallow my grandson. We arrived at the estate just as a marked county vehicle pulled into the driveway. I marched through the front doors, bypassing the stunned private nanny, and intercepted the field agent before she could even fill out the removal paperwork. I asserted my immediate familial rights, establishing temporary physical custody on the spot. I wrapped my grandson in a warm blanket, carried him out to my truck, and brought him home. He slept peacefully in my quiet house, completely unaware of the devastating domestic warfare that had just dismantled his entire family tree. But temporary custody was not enough. I required absolute permanent legal authority. The very next morning, at exactly 8 o'clock, Oliver Stanton and I walked through the double-glass doors of the Fulton County Department of Child Protective Services. The building was a dreary, fluorescent-lit labyrinth of overworked employees and broken families. The air smelled of stale coffee and bureaucratic despair. I wore my usual faded denim jeans and a simple button-down shirt. Oliver walked beside me in his immaculate razor-sharp navy suit, carrying a thick, locking leather briefcase. We were escorted into a small, cramped conference room where Agent Davis sat behind a cluttered desk. A senior family court mediator joined us, looking exhausted and ready to process yet another tragic statistic into the overcrowded foster care system. Agent Davis folded her hands on her desk, looking at me with a mixture of professional sympathy and systemic doubt. "Mr. Hayes," she began, her voice maintaining a strict procedural tone, "we sincerely appreciate your emergency intervention last night. It is always our preference to keep a child with biological relatives when an immediate crisis occurs. However, placing an infant into a permanent custodial arrangement is a highly rigorous process. We must heavily evaluate your physical environment, your age, and most importantly, your financial capacity to raise a child. An infant requires a tremendous amount of resources, healthcare, and long-term stability. Looking at your profile, we have to ask if you are truly equipped to handle this massive financial burden on a fixed retirement income." She looked at my calloused hands and my simple clothes, making the exact same arrogant, entirely incorrect assumption that Chelsea had made for years. She saw an aging blue-collar black man and instantly assumed I was a struggling pensioner who would need state assistance to buy baby formula. She believed she was dealing with a standard low-income placement case. I did not take offense to her systemic bias. I simply turned my head and gave Oliver Stanton a brief, silent nod. Oliver did not offer a polite explanation. He stepped forward, placed his heavy briefcase directly onto the center of the cramped conference table, and popped the metallic latches. He withdrew a pristine, heavily bound legal portfolio and slid it directly across the desk toward Agent Davis and the mediator. "My client is not surviving on a fixed state pension." Agent Davis, Oliver stated, his voice projecting a cold, absolute authority that instantly changed the entire temperature of the room. "You are currently looking at the certified financial disclosures of the Hayes Family Trust. My client is the sole founder and primary executor of a massive private equity and commercial real estate empire. His current liquid assets, corporate holdings, and investment portfolios are valued in the tens of millions of dollars. He does not require state assistance. He is capable of buying this entire building in cash before lunch." Agent Davis stopped breathing. The exhausted family court mediator suddenly sat up perfectly straight in his chair. They opened the portfolio, their eyes widening in absolute paralyzing shock as they scanned the authenticated bank statements, the list of commercial properties, and the multi-million-dollar trust funds. Oliver did not give them a single second to recover from their astonishment. He pulled out a second stack of documents and laid them out methodically. Furthermore, Oliver continued, dominating the room with surgical precision. "My client has already retained a team of elite private pediatricians on a permanent retainer. He has fully funded a platinum-tier educational trust to cover the child's tuition from preschool through a postgraduate degree. The primary residence has been thoroughly inspected, heavily secured with a military-grade surveillance system, and a professional, fully vetted, background-checked nanny has been hired to assist with daily care. My client is not merely capable of providing a stable environment. He is offering an impenetrable gold-plated safety net that the state of Georgia could never possibly replicate. The social worker was completely speechless. The standard bureaucratic hurdles she had prepared to throw at me were entirely pulverized by the sheer, overwhelming magnitude of my financial and legal preparation. She looked up from the documents, viewing me through an entirely different lens. The simple, uneducated laborer she had dismissed moments ago was actually a towering titan of industry. The mediator cleared his throat, desperately trying to regain control of the procedural meeting. "This is highly irregular but incredibly impressive, Mr. Hayes. However, the law requires us to exhaust all biological avenues. The child's mother is currently facing a federal indictment, and the father, your son Jared, has completely abandoned his parental duties and remains unreachable. But we must also consider the maternal grandparents. William and Catherine Whitmore have a legal right to petition for custody. They reside in a prominent estate in Alpharetta, and we must evaluate their household as a potential placement before granting you sole conservatorship." I smiled, a cold, hard expression that made the mediator flinch. Oliver reached into his briefcase for the final time. He withdrew a fresh stack of foreclosure notices and federal bankruptcy filings. "You will not need to waste your time contacting the Whitmore family," Oliver declared, dropping the devastating evidence onto the desk. "William and Catherine Whitmore are entirely bankrupt. All of their credit lines have been permanently severed. Their bank accounts are completely frozen by the Federal Reserve, and they are currently facing an active, aggressive eviction from that Alpharetta estate. They cannot afford to feed themselves, let alone provide a safe, stable environment for a growing infant. They possess absolutely zero financial capacity, and their daughter is currently sitting in a federal penitentiary awaiting trial for wire fraud. The maternal bloodline is entirely compromised. The absolute destruction of the Whitmore legacy was documented in stark black and white ink. There was absolutely no legal argument left to make. The maternal grandparents were ruined. The mother was a federal criminal, and the father was a homeless coward who had run away into the night. I was the only pillar of strength left standing in the entire family tree. The mediator reviewed the bankruptcy filings, let out a heavy sigh of disbelief, and reached for his pen. The case was completely airtight. Within 20 minutes, the emergency family court judge reviewed the unprecedented evidence packet and immediately signed the binding legal decrees. The parental rights of Jared Hayes and Chelsea Whitmore Hayes were formally suspended. The maternal grandparents were legally barred from claiming any custodial rights. I was officially granted total, unrestricted, permanent legal and physical custody of my grandson. The toxic, parasitic branches of his family tree had been aggressively severed, ensuring they could never poison his future. I walked out of the Department of Child Protective Services holding the heavy stamped legal documents in my hand. The cold, rainy atmosphere of the previous night had completely cleared, replaced by a bright, piercing morning sun that washed over the Atlanta skyline. I climbed into the driver's seat of my faded Ford pickup truck and looked into the rearview mirror. My grandson was safely strapped into his car seat, sleeping peacefully, entirely shielded from the catastrophic storm that had just leveled his parents' lives. I started the engine and drove away from the city center, feeling a profound, absolute sense of peace settling deeply into my bones. The horrific cycle of elite entitlement, pathetic cowardice, and malicious greed had been permanently broken. My grandson would not be raised in a toxic mansion surrounded by fake, status-obsessed predators. He would not be taught to judge people by the color of their skin or the fabric of their shirts. He would be raised in my home under my strict guidance. I would teach him the absolute value of grueling hard work, the unbreakable importance of personal honor, and the true meaning of genuine kindness. The only bloodline I had left in this world was finally safe, and he would be raised to be a real man. 6 months passed since the storm cleared from my life. The chaotic dust of the legal battles finally settled, leaving a brand new, meticulously ordered landscape in its wake. The federal court system moved with a swift and merciless efficiency when presented with the ironclad evidence dossier compiled by my legal team and the forensic auditors. Chelsea did not get the luxurious, high-profile trial she had probably fantasized about. Stripped of her corporate funds and entirely abandoned by the bankrupt Whitmore family, she was forced to rely on an overworked public defender who had absolutely no patience for her aristocratic tantrums. The federal judge was not moved by her theatrical tears or her sudden manufactured remorse during the sentencing hearing. She was convicted on multiple felony counts of interstate wire fraud and international tax evasion. She was handed a mandatory sentence of 5 years in a federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. She traded her tailored red silk gowns for a standardized scratchy prison uniform and her glamorous charity galas for a small, windowless concrete cell. Meanwhile, the great Whitmore legacy she had weaponized against me completely evaporated into thin air. My asset recovery firm foreclosed on their Alpharetta estate with zero hesitation or mercy. William and Catherine Whitmore were physically evicted from their sprawling mansion by local sheriffs. Their luxury vehicles were seized by towing companies and their exclusive country club memberships were publicly and humiliatingly revoked. With absolutely no remaining capital and their elite social circle aggressively turning their backs on them, they were forced to relocate to a decaying low-income apartment complex on the industrial outskirts of the city. The arrogant people who once looked down their noses at my faded plaid shirts were now struggling to pay for basic electricity and water in a neighborhood they previously would not even drive through with their windows rolled down. Their artificial superiority had been completely dismantled, replaced by the grim daily reality of absolute poverty. As for my son, the legal system and the harsh, unforgiving reality of the working class caught up to him with equal severity. Jared had walked out into the freezing rain with absolutely nothing, and that is exactly where he remained. Stripped of his high-paying marketing job due to the immense public scandal and completely cut off from the Hayes family trust, he was forced to face the real world without a financial safety net. He could no longer hide behind my wealth or his wife's fake elite status. During the custody proceedings, the family court had mandated strict, non-negotiable child support payments for my grandson. To meet those aggressive monthly obligations, Jared was forced to take a grueling minimum wage job as a night shift delivery driver for a local commercial logistics warehouse. The man who used to parade around in tailored tuxedos and flash a $30,000 solid gold Rolex was now spending 10 to 12 hours a day hauling heavy cardboard boxes up flights of stairs in a cheap, poorly fitting polyester uniform. He broke his back lifting packages in the sweltering, oppressive Georgia heat, driving a rusted second-hand sedan just to make ends meet. He was experiencing the exact grueling physical labor he and his wife had so deeply despised and mocked. He was forced to deliver packages to the very same upscale Buckhead neighborhoods where he used to attend lavish dinner parties, lowering his head in shame whenever he recognized a former acquaintance. Every single month, a significant fraction of his meager paycheck was automatically garnished by the state and deposited into a separate locked account I managed exclusively for his son. I did not need a single dime of his money to raise my grandson, but I ensured the payments were strictly and aggressively enforced. It was a necessary monthly reminder of the profound responsibilities he had cowardly abandoned and the devastating price of his ultimate betrayal. While the parasites of my past were busy surviving the miserable, inescapable consequences of their own actions, I focused my massive resources on building a genuine, lasting legacy. I had spent 40 years of my life constructing physical skyscrapers, pouring concrete, and tying steel, but it was finally time to build something far more vital and enduring. I coordinated heavily with Oliver Stanton and my trusted financial advisory board to permanently restructure the Hayes Family Trust. We gathered the top academic administrators, university presidents, and community leaders in Atlanta for a major, highly publicized press conference at a prestigious downtown venue. Standing behind a polished wooden podium flanked by the very best legal and financial minds in the state, I officially announced the creation of a $10 million philanthropic initiative. It was an educational endowment specifically dedicated to providing full-ride, comprehensive scholarships for underprivileged, high-achieving students attending historically black colleges and universities across the American South. The fund was meticulously designed to cover tuition, housing, textbooks, and professional mentorship programs for brilliant young men and women who possessed raw, undeniable talent but lacked the financial backing of elite families. I did not name the foundation after myself. I named it in honor of my late wife, the woman who had stood by my side when we had absolutely nothing, the woman who had worked tirelessly to build our original foundation long before the immense wealth had accumulated. I looked out at the flashing cameras and the crowded room of journalists speaking with a resonant, undeniable pride. I stated clearly into the microphones that true power is not measured by the zip code you reside in, the designer labels you wear, or the elite clubs you bribe your way into. True power is utilizing your resources to uplift the next generation of hard-working minds who understand the absolute value of integrity and discipline. I was taking the wealth that Chelsea and Jared had maliciously tried to steal for their shallow, pathetic ambitions and pouring it directly into the future of ambitious black students who would actually appreciate and honor the opportunity. The announcement sent massive shockwaves through the corporate and philanthropic communities of Atlanta. The simple blue-collar laborer they had all ignored or underestimated was now permanently reshaping the educational and economic landscape of the entire city. As the press conference concluded and the grand room erupted into a thunderous standing ovation, I stepped down from the podium and walked slowly toward the massive floor-to-ceiling glass windows of the venue. The bright afternoon sun illuminated the busy downtown street outside. Through the thick-tinted glass, I noticed a solitary figure standing perfectly still on the wet pavement separated from the celebration by an impenetrable physical and social barrier. It was Jared. He was wearing a faded, sweat-stained delivery uniform, clutching a damaged digital clipboard tightly to his chest. He had paused his grueling delivery route just to stand on the sidewalk and watch the historic event unfold from the outside looking in. Our eyes locked through the heavy pane of glass. I saw his shoulders slump forward under the crushing, unbearable weight of his monumental regret. He was looking at the father he had betrayed, witnessing the incredible, world-changing legacy he could have easily been a part of if he had only chosen honor over greed. The immense, agonizing realization of what he had permanently thrown away was etched deeply into every line of his exhausted, prematurely aging face. He was an outsider now, permanently exiled to watch my empire thrive from the cold, unforgiving streets. I did not wave, I did not smile, I did not offer a single nod of acknowledgement. I simply broke eye contact, turned my back to the glass, and walked back to my grandson. The deafening applause from the press conference and the frantic flashing of camera lenses eventually faded into the quiet rhythm of my new daily life. I traded the crowded downtown avenues and the sterile corporate boardrooms for the absolute sanctuary of my own backyard. I sat comfortably in a heavy wooden Adirondack chair under the sprawling shade of a massive oak tree. The late afternoon Georgia sun filtered through the thick green canopy, casting a warm golden glow across the perfectly manicured lawn. I held a simple ceramic mug of sweet tea in my calloused hand, letting the condensation bead against my fingers. The air smelled of freshly cut grass and blooming magnolias, a stark, beautiful contrast to the toxic, suffocating atmosphere that had once poisoned my kitchen. A few yards away, my grandson was busy executing a highly uncoordinated but deeply enthusiastic sprint across the yard. He was chasing a bright yellow rubber ball, his small legs pumping furiously, his pure, unrestrained laughter echoing off the high brick walls that secured our perimeter. He was wearing denim overalls and a tiny plaid shirt, looking exactly like a miniature version of the hard-working men who had built this country. He stumbled over a thick tree root, falling softly onto the thick grass, but he did not cry. He simply pushed himself back up, wiped his small hands on his pants, and continued his pursuit with absolute determination. I watched him with a profound, overwhelming sense of peace. He was completely insulated from the devastating, catastrophic ruin that had consumed his biological parents. He would never know the cold, desperate interior of a federal prison cell where his mother currently resided. He would never feel the crushing, humiliating weight of the delivery boxes his father hauled up endless flights of stairs for minimum wage. He was safe. He was entirely protected by an impenetrable fortress of legal boundaries and overwhelming financial resources. I took a slow sip of my sweet tea, savoring the quiet victory of a Tuesday afternoon. The chaotic warfare of lawyers' audits and police sirens felt like a distant, faded nightmare. I had aggressively pruned the diseased branches from my family tree, and the remaining roots were finally drinking in the sunlight. For decades, I had viewed my accumulated wealth simply as a quiet, necessary tool for survival. I built my corporate empire pouring concrete and tying steel because I wanted to ensure my bloodline would never experience the brutal, grinding poverty I had endured as a young man. But the harrowing events of the past year had fundamentally, entirely reshaped my understanding of capital. Money is not inherently evil, nor is it inherently righteous. It is simply a highly conductive amplifier of human nature. In the hands of a superficial, arrogant predator like Chelsea, it was a toxic, corrosive poison used to buy fake aristocracy and mask a rotting moral foundation. In the hands of a coward like Jared, it was a heavy chain that completely paralyzed his spine and stripped him of his basic manhood. They worshipped the illusion of wealth, believing that designer labels and luxury mansions elevated them above the basic rules of human decency. They fundamentally misunderstood the true architecture of power. I looked down at my worn hands, tracing the deep, permanent scars left by decades of brutal physical labor. Real wealth is not a golden ticket to act like a tyrant. It is a highly specialized weapon. It is an impenetrable titanium shield designed to wrap around the people you genuinely love, protecting them from the ruthless, unforgiving machinery of the world. It provides the elite pediatricians the secure housing and the premier education that my grandson will now enjoy without question. But when provoked, when a parasitic force attempts to invade your sanctuary and exploit your generosity, that exact same wealth transforms into a devastating razor-sharp sword. It is the overwhelming legal force that crushes a fraudulent empire in a single afternoon. It is the forensic accounting team that dismantles a federal wire fraud scheme. It is the absolute unilateral power to financially starve a predator into total submission. I did not destroy Chelsea and Jared because I was a bitter, vindictive old man. I destroyed them because they mistook my quiet humility for weakness. They assumed my faded clothes and calloused hands meant I was an easy mark. They learned the hardest, most unforgiving lesson the world has to offer. You do not invite a wolf into your home, and you absolutely do not attempt to steal from a man who laid the very foundation you are standing on. The profound, heavy silence of the garden was briefly interrupted by a short, sharp vibration in my chest pocket. I reached in and pulled out my smartphone, the screen illuminating brightly against the shade of the oak tree. It was an automated, encrypted notification from the executive wealth management team handling the Hayes Family Trust. The brief digital message outlined the latest quarterly dividend yields from my commercial real estate holdings and private equity portfolios. The numbers flashing across the screen were staggering. The passive interest alone generated over the last 90 days was more than most hardworking people would see in an entire lifetime. The corporate properties were thriving. The reinvested capital from the liquidated Buckhead estate was yielding aggressive returns. The financial empire I had built was operating with flawless mechanical precision, completely unbothered by the domestic warfare that had briefly threatened its perimeter. I stared at the massive string of zeros glowing on the digital display. A year ago, my former daughter-in-law would have gladly committed murder to gain unrestricted access to a fraction of that specific account. My son had permanently destroyed his entire future, his marriage and his relationship with his only child, trying to steal it. They had sacrificed their freedom and their dignity for a pile of digital currency they were never smart enough to manage. I read the notification again and felt absolutely nothing toward the money itself. The massive expanding wealth did not make my heart beat faster. It did not fill me with a desperate, arrogant need to drive to a luxury car dealership or purchase a flashy gold watch to flaunt in front of my neighbors. The numbers were just numbers. They were simply the secure, reinforced concrete walls surrounding the peaceful life I had fought so brutally to defend. The true, undeniable return on my investment was not sitting in a high-yield offshore bank account. It was currently running across the grass, attempting to catch a butterfly with his bare hands. I tapped the power button on the side of the device, instantly blacking out the screen and silencing the endless stream of corporate data. I tossed the expensive smartphone carelessly onto the small wooden table next to my chair, completely dismissing the millions of dollars it represented. I did not need to check the stock market. I did not need to review another legal brief or sign another commercial lease. The war was definitively, permanently over. I stood up from the Adirondack chair, stretching my stiff joints, and stepped out from under the shade of the great oak tree. The warm Georgia sun hit my face, washing away the last lingering shadows of the betrayal. "Grandpa, look," my grandson yelled, his face lighting up with absolute pure joy as he held up the yellow rubber ball like a magnificent prized trophy. "I am looking, little man," I called back, my voice booming with a deep, unrestrained happiness I had not felt in decades. "Throw it here. Let us see how strong that arm is." I walked out into the center of the bright green lawn, leaving the heavy world of lawyers, trust funds, and federal prisons entirely behind me. I was a man who had successfully navigated the absolute worst of human greed and emerged completely victorious. I had reclaimed my bloodline, secured my legacy, and finally achieved the ultimate rare luxury of absolute, uncompromising freedom. The greatest lesson I took from this entire ordeal is that love is not blind, and love with boundaries is true love. Society often teaches us to endure endless abuse from our relatives under the strict guise of family loyalty. However, if someone who says they love you is capable of harming you for money or convenience, that person does not really love you. They are simply a parasite wearing a familiar face. Cutting toxic people out of your life, even if they share your last name, is never an act of cruelty. It is the ultimate act of self-preservation and profound self-respect. If you found value in my journey, please share your thoughts in the comments below and subscribe to the channel for more stories about finding the absolute courage to stand up for your dignity.